Story number 19 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, May 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Gossip of Valley View. It was the 1st of April, and Julius Barrett, aged 14, perched on his father's gate-post, watched ruefully the low-descending sun, and counted that day lost. He had not succeeded in fooling a single person, although he had tried repeatedly. One and all, old and young, of his intended victims had been too wary for Julius. Hence, Julius was disgusted and ready for anything in the way of a stratagem or a spoil. The Barrett gatepost topped the highest hill in Valley View. Julius could see the entire settlement, from young Thomas Everett's farm, a mile to the west, to Adelia Williams' weather-grey little house on a moonrise slope to the east. He was gazing moodily down the muddy road when Dan Chester, homeward bound from the post office, came riding sloppily along on his grey mare and pulled up by the Barrett gate to hand a paper to Julius. Dan was a young man who took life and himself very seriously. He seldom smiled, never joked, and had a Washingtonian reputation for veracity. Dan had never told a conscious falsehood in his life. He never even exaggerated. Julius, beholding Dan's solemn face, was seized with a perfectly irresistible desire to fool him. At the same moment his eye caught the dazzling reflection of the setting sun on the windows of Adelia Williams's house, and he had an inspiration little short of diabolical. "Have you heard the news, Dan?" he asked. "No, what news?" asked Dan. "I don't know as I ought to tell it," said Julius reflectively. "It's kind of a family affair. But then Adelia didn't say not to, and anyway, it'll be all over the place soon. So I'll tell you, Dan, if you'll promise never to tell who told you. Adelia Williams and young Thomas Everett are going to be married." Julius delivered himself of this tremendous lie with a transparently earnest countenance. Yet Dan, credulous as he was, could not believe it all at once. "Get out," he said. "It's true, 'pon my word," protested Julius. "Adelia was up last night and told Ma all about it. Ma's her cousin, you know. The wedding is to be in June, and Adelia asked Ma to help her get her quilts and things ready." Julius reeled all of this off so glibly that Dan finally believed the story, despite the fact that the people thus coupled together in prospective matrimony were the very last people in Valley View who could have been expected to marry each other. Young Thomas was a confirmed bachelor of 50, and Adelia Williams was 40. They were not supposed to be even well acquainted, as the Everetts and the Williamses had never been very friendly, although no open feud existed between them. Nevertheless, in view of Julius's circumstantial statements, the amazing news must be true, and Dan was instantly agog to carry it further. Julius watched Dan and the grey mare out of sight, fairly writhing with ecstasy. Oh, but Dan had been easy. The story would be all over Valley View in 24 hours. Julius laughed until he came near to falling off the gatepost. At this point, Julius and Danny drop out of our story, and young Thomas enters. It was 2 days later when young Thomas heard that he was to be married to Adelia Williams in June. Eben Clark, the blacksmith, told him when he went to the forge to get his horse shod. Young Thomas laughed his big, jolly laugh. Valley View gossip had been marrying him off for the last 30 years, although never before to Adelia Williams. "It's news to me," he said tolerantly. Eben grinned broadly. "Ah, you can't bluff it off like that," Tommy said. "The news came too straight this time." "Well, I was glad to hear it, although I was mighty surprised. I never thought of you and Adelia, but she's a fine little woman and will make you a capital wife." Young Thomas grunted and drove away. He had a good deal of business to do that day, involving calls at various places: the store for molasses, the mill for flour, Jim Bentley's for seed grain, the doctor's for toothache drops for his housekeeper, the post office for mail, and at each and every place he was joked about his approaching marriage. In the end, it rather annoyed Young Thomas. He drove home at last in what was for him something of a temper. How on earth had this fool story started? With such detailed circumstantiality of rugs and quilts, too. Adelia Williams must be going to marry somebody, and the Valley View gossips, unable to locate the man, had guessed Young Thomas. When he reached home, tired, muddy bespattered, and hungry, his housekeeper, who was also his hired man's wife, asked him if it was true that he was going to be married. Young Thomas, taking it at a glance, the ill-prepared, half-cold supper on the table, felt more annoyed than ever, and said it wasn't, with a strong expression. Not quite an oath, for Young Thomas never swore, unless swearing be as much a matter of intonation as of words. Mrs. Dunn sighed, patted her swelled face, and said she was sorry. She had hoped it was true, for her man had decided to go west. They were to go in a month's time. Young Thomas sat down to his supper with the prospect of having to look up another housekeeper and hired man before planting, to destroy his appetite. Next day, 3 people who came to see Young Thomas on business congratulated him on his approaching marriage. Young Thomas, who had recovered his usual good humour, merely laughed. There was no use in being too earnest in denial, he thought. He knew that his usual fit of petulance with his housekeeper had only convinced her that the story was true. It would die away in time, as other similar stories had died, he thought. Valley View gossip was imaginative. Young Thomas looked rather serious, however, when the minister and his wife called that evening and referred to the report. Young Thomas gravely said that it was unfounded. The minister looked graver still and said he was sorry. He had hoped it was true. His wife glanced significantly about Young Thomas's big, untidy sitting room, where there were cobwebs on the ceiling and fluff in the corners and dust on the mopboard, and said nothing, but looked volumes. "Dang it all," said Young Thomas as they drove away. "They'll marry me yet in spite of myself." The gossip made him think about Adelia Williams. He had never thought about her before. He was barely acquainted with her. Now he remembered that she was a plump, jolly-looking little woman, noted for being a good housekeeper. Then Young Thomas groaned, remembering that he must start out looking for a housekeeper soon, and housekeepers were not easily found, as Young Thomas had discovered several times since his mother's death 10 years before. Next Sunday in church, Young Thomas looked at Adelia Williams. He caught Adelia looking at him. Adelia blushed and looked guiltily away. "Dang it all," reflected Young Thomas, forgetting that he was in church. "I suppose she had heard that fool story too. I'd like to know the person who started it. Man or woman, I'd punch their head." Nevertheless, Young Thomas went on looking at Adelia, by fits and starts, although he did not again catch Adelia looking at him. He noticed that she had round, rosy cheeks and twinkling brown eyes. She did not look like an old maid, and Young Thomas wondered that she had been allowed to become one. Sarah Barnett, now, to whom report had married him a year ago, looked like a dried sour apple. For the next 4 weeks the story haunted Young Thomas like a spectre. Down it would not. Everywhere he went he was joked about it. It gathered fresh detail every week. Adelia was getting her clothes ready. She was to be married in seal brown cashmere. Vinnie Lawrence at Valley Centre was making it for her. She had got a new hat with a long ostrich plume. Some said white, some said gray. Young Thomas kept wondering who the man could be, for he was convinced that Adelia was going to marry somebody. More than that, once he caught himself wondering enviously. Adelia was a nice-looking woman, and he had not so far heard of any probable housekeeper. "Dang it all," said Young Thomas to himself in desperation. "I wouldn't care if it was true." His married sister from Carlisle heard the story and came over to investigate. Young Thomas denied it shortly, and his sister scolded. She had devoutly hoped it was true, she said, and it would have been a great weight off her mind. "This house is in a disgraceful condition, Thomas," she said severely. "It would break Mother's heart if she could rise out of her grave to see it. And Adelia Williams is a perfect housekeeper." "You didn't used to think so much of the Williams crowd," said Young Thomas dryly. "Oh, some of them don't amount to much," admitted Maria, "but Adelia's all right." Catching sight of an odd look on Young Thomas's face, she added hastily, "Thomas Everett, I believe it's true after all. Now, is it? For mercy's sake, don't be so sly. You might tell me your own and only sister, if it is." "Oh, shut up," was Young Thomas's unfeeling reply to his own and only sister. Young Thomas told himself that night that Valley View gossip would drive him into an asylum yet if it didn't let up. He also wondered if Adelia was as much persecuted as himself. No doubt she was. He never could catch her eye in church now, but he would have been surprised had he realized how many times he tried to. The climax came the third week in May, when Young Thomas, who had been keeping house for himself for 3 weeks, received a letter and an express box from his cousin, Charles Everett, out in Manitoba. Charles and he had been chums in their boyhood. They corresponded occasionally still, although it was 20 years since Charles had gone west. The letter was to congratulate Young Thomas on his approaching marriage. Charles had heard of it through some Valley View correspondence of his wife. He was much pleased. He had always liked Adelia, he said. Had been an old beau of hers, in fact. Thomas might give her a kiss for him, if he liked. He forwarded a wedding present by express and hoped they would be very happy, etc. The present was an elaborate hat rack of polished buffalo horns, mounted on red plush with an inset mirror. Young Thomas set it up on the kitchen table and scowled moodily at his reflection in the mirror. If wedding presents were beginning to come, it was high time something was done. The matter was past being a joke. This affair of the present would certainly get out. Things always got out in Valley View, dang it all, and he would never hear the last of it. "I'll marry," said Young Thomas decisively. "If Adelia Williams won't have me, I'll marry the first woman who will, if it's Sarah Barnett herself." Young Thomas shaved and put on his Sunday suit. As soon as it was safely dark, he hied him away to Adelia Williams. He felt very doubtful about his reception, but the remembrance of the twinkle in Adelia's brown eye comforted him. She looked like a woman who had a sense of humour. She might not take him, but she would not feel offended or insulted because he asked her. "Dang it all, though, I hope she will take me," said Young Thomas. "I'm in for getting married now and no mistake, and I can't get Adelia out of my head. I've been thinking of her steady ever since that confounded gossip began." When he knocked at Adelia's door, he discovered that his face was wet with perspiration. Adelia opened the door and started when she saw him. Then she turned very red and stiffly asked him in. Young Thomas went in and sat down, wondering if all men felt so horribly uncomfortable when they went courting. Adelia stooped low over the wood box to put a stick of wood in the stove, for the May evening was chilling. Her shoulders were shaking. The shaking grew worse. Suddenly Adelia laughed hysterically, and sitting down on the wood box continued to laugh. Young Thomas eyed her with a friendly grin. "Oh, do excuse me," gasped poor Adelia, wiping tears from her eyes. "This is dreadful. I didn't mean to laugh. I don't know why I'm laughing, but I can't help it." She laughed helplessly again. Young Thomas laughed too. His embarrassment vanished in the mellowness of that laughter. Presently Adelia composed herself and removed from the wood box to a chair, but there was still a suspicious twitching about the corners of her mouth. "I suppose," said Young Thomas, determined to have it over with before the ice could form again, "I suppose, Adelia, you've heard the story that's been going about you and me of late." Adelia nodded. "I've been persecuted to the verge of insanity with it," she said. "Every soul I've seen has tormented me about it, and people have written me about it. I've denied it till I was black in the face, but nobody believed me. I can't find out how it started. I hope you believe, Mr. Everett, that it couldn't possibly have arisen from anything I said. I've felt dreadfully worried for fear you might think it did. I heard that my cousin Lucilla Barrett said I told her, but Lucilla vowed to me that she never said such a thing or even dreamed of it. I've felt dreadful bad over the whole affair. I even gave up the idea of making a quilt after a lovely new pattern I've got because they made such a talk about my brown dress. I've been kind of supposing that you must be going to marry somebody, and folks just guessed it was me," said Young Thomas. He said it anxiously. "No, I'm not going to be married to anybody," said Adelia with a laugh, taking up her knitting. "I'm glad of that," said Young Thomas gravely. "I mean," he hastened to add, seeing the look of astonishment on Adelia's face, "that I'm glad there isn't any other man, because I want you myself, Adelia." Adelia laid down her knitting and blushed crimson, but she looked at Young Thomas squarely and reproachfully. "You needn't think you're bound to say that because of the gossip, Mr. Everett," she said quietly. "Oh, I don't," said Young Thomas earnestly. "But the truth is the story set me to thinking about you, and from that I got to wishing it was true. Honest, I did. I couldn't get you out of my head, and at last I didn't want to. It just seemed to me that you were the very woman for me if you'd only take me. Will you, Adelia? I've got a good farm and house, and I'll try to make you happy." It was not a very romantic wooing, perhaps, but Adelia was 40 and had never been a romantic little body even in the heyday of youth. She was a practical woman, and Young Thomas was a fine-looking man of his age with abundance of worldly goods. Besides, she liked him, and the gossip had made her think a good deal about him of late. Indeed, in a moment of candour, she had owned to herself the very last Sunday in church that she wouldn't mind if the story were true. "I'll think of it," she said. This was practically an acceptance, and Young Thomas so understood it. Without loss of time he crossed the kitchen, sat down beside Adelia, and put his arms about her plump waist. "Here's a kiss Charlie sent me to give you," he said, giving it. End of The Gossip of Valley View. Story number 20 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, May 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Letters. Just before the letter was brought to me that evening, I was watching the red November sunset from the library window. It was a stormy, unrestful sunset, gleaming angrily through the dark fir boughs that were now and again tossed suddenly and distressfully in a fitful gust of wind. Below in the garden it was quite dark, and I could only see dimly the dead leaves that were whirling and dancing uncannily over the roseless paths. The poor dead leaves, yet not quite dead. There was still enough unquiet life left in them to make them restless and forlorn. They hearkened yet to every call of the wind, who cared for them no longer, but only played freakishly with them and broke their rest. I felt sorry for the leaves as I watched them in that dull, weird twilight, and angry in a petulant fashion that almost made me laugh, with the wind that would not leave them in peace. Why should they, and I, be vexed with these transient breaths of desire for a life that had passed us by? I was in the grip of a bitter loneliness that evening, so bitter and so insistent that I felt I could not face the future at all, even with such poor fragments of courage as I had gathered about me after Father's death, hoping that they would at least suffice for my endurance, if not for my content. But now they fell away from me at sight of the emptiness of life. The emptiness. Ah, it was from that I shrank. I could have faced pain and anxiety and heartbreak undauntedly, but I could not face that terrible, yawning, barren emptiness. I put my hands over my eyes to shut it out, but it pressed in upon my consciousness insistently and would not be ignored longer. The moment when a woman realizes that she has nothing to live for, neither love, nor purpose, nor duty, holds for her the bitterness of death. She is a brave woman indeed who can look upon such a prospect unquailingly, and I was not brave. I was weak and timid. Had not Father often laughed mockingly at me because of it? It was 3 weeks since Father had died, my proud, handsome, unrelenting old father, whom I had loved so intensely, and who had never loved me. I had always accepted this fact unresentfully and unquestioningly, but it had steeped my whole life in its tincture of bitterness. Father had never forgiven me for 2 things. I had cost my mother's life, and I was not a son to perpetuate the old name and carry on the family feud with the Frasers. I was a very lonely child, with no playmates or companions of any sort, and my girlhood was lonelier still. The only passion in my life was my love for my father. I would have done and suffered anything to win his affection in return, but all I ever did win was an amused tolerance, and I was grateful for that, almost content. It was much to have something to love and be permitted to love it. If I had been a beautiful and spirited girl, I think Father might have loved me, but I was neither. At first I did not think or care about my lack of beauty. Then one day I was alone in the beech wood. I was trying to disentangle my skirt, which had caught on some thorny underbrush. A young man came around the curve of the path, and seeing my predicament, bent with murmured apology to help me. He had to kneel to do it, and I saw a ray of sunshine falling through the beeches above us, strike like a lance of light athwart the thick brown hair that pushed out from under his cap. Before I thought, I put out my hand and touched it softly. Then I blushed crimson with shame over what I had done. But he did not know. He never knew. When he had released my dress, he rose, and our eyes met for a moment as I timidly thanked him. I saw that he was good to look upon, tall and straight, with broad, stalwart shoulders and dark, clean-cut face. He had a firm, sensitive mouth and kindly, pleasant, dark blue eyes. I never quite forgot the look in those eyes. It made my heart beat strangely, but it was only for a moment, and the next he had lifted his cap and passed on. As I went homeward, I wondered who he might be. He must be a stranger, I thought, probably a visitor in some of our few neighbouring families. I wondered, too, if I should meet him again, and found the thought very pleasant. I knew few men, and they were all old like Father, or at least elderly. They were the only people who ever came to our house, and they either teased me or overlooked me. None of them was at all like this young man I had met in the beech wood, nor ever could have been, I thought. When I reached home, I stopped before the big mirror that hung in the hall and did what I had never done before in my life. Looked at myself very scrutinizingly and wondered if I had any beauty. I could only sorrowfully conclude that I had not. I was so slight and pale, and the thick black hair and dark eyes that might have been pretty in another woman seemed only to accentuate the lack of spirit and regularity in my features. I was still standing there, gazing wistfully at my mirrored face, with a strange sinking of spirit, when Father came through the hall, his riding whip in his hand. Seeing me, he laughed. "Don't waste your time gazing into mirrors, Isabel," he said carelessly. "That might have been excusable in former ladies of Shirley, whose beauty might pardon and even adorn vanity. But with you it is only absurd. The needle and the cookbook are all that you need concern yourself with." I was accustomed to such speeches from him, but they had never hurt me so cruelly before. At that moment I would have given all the world only to be beautiful. The next Sunday I looked across the church, and in the Fraser pew I saw the young man I had met in the wood. He was looking at me with his arms folded over his breast, and on his brow a little frown that seemed somehow indicative of pain and surprise. I felt a miserable sense of disappointment. If he were the Frasers' guest, I could not expect to meet him again. Father hated the Frasers. All the Shirleys hated them. It was an old feud, bitter and lasting, that had been as much our inheritance for generations as land and money. The only thing Father had ever taken pains to teach me was detestation of the Frasers and all their works. I accepted this as I accepted all the other traditions of my race. I thought it did not matter much. The Frasers were not likely to come my way, and hatred was a good satisfying passion in the lack of all else. I think I rather took a pride in hating them, as became my blood. I did not look at the Fraser pew again, but outside under the elms we met him, standing in the dappling light and shadow. He looked very handsome and a little sad. I could not help glancing back over my shoulder as Father and I walked to the gate, and I saw him looking after us with that little frown which again made me think something had hurt him. I liked better the smile he had worn in the beech wood, but I had an odd liking for the frown too, and I think I had a foolish longing to go back to him, put up my fingers and smooth it away. "So Alan Fraser had come home," said my father. "Alan Fraser?" I repeated, with a strange, horrible feeling of coldness and chill coming over me, like a shadow on a bright day. Alan Fraser, the son of old Malcolm Fraser of Glenellyn, the son of our enemy. He had been living since childhood with his dead mother's people, so much I knew, and this was he. Something stung and smarted in my eyes. I think the sting and smart might have turned to tears if Father had not been looking down at me. "Yes, didn't you see him in his father's pew? But I forgot. You are too demure to be looking at the young men and preaching, or out of it, Isabel. You are a model young woman. Odd that the men never like the model young women. Curse old Malcolm Fraser. What right has he to have a son like that when I have nothing but a puling girl? Remember, Isabel, that if you ever meet that young man you are not to speak to or look at him, or even intimate that you are aware of his existence. He is your enemy and the enemy of your race. You will show him that you realize this." Of course, that ended it all, though just what there had been to end would have been hard to say. Not long afterwards I met Alan Fraser again, when I was out for a canter on my mare. He was strolling through the beechwood with a couple of big collies, and he stopped short as I drew near. I had to do it. Father had decreed. My Shirley pride demanded that I should do it. I looked him unseeingly in the face, struck my mare a blow with my whip, and dashed past him. I even felt angry. I think that a Fraser should have the power to make me feel so badly in doing my duty. After that I had forgotten. There was nothing to make me remember, for I never met Alan Fraser again. The years slipped by one, so like each other in their colourlessness that I forgot to take account of them. I only knew that I grew older, and that it did not matter, since there was nobody to care. One day they brought Father in, white-lipped and groaning. His mare had thrown him, and he was never to walk again, although he lived for 5 years. Those 5 years had been the happiest of my life. For the first time I was necessary to someone. There was something for me to do which nobody else could do so well. I was Father's nurse and companion, and I found my pleasure in tending him and amusing him, soothing his hours of pain and brightening his hours of ease. People said I did my duty toward him. I had never liked that word duty since the day I had ridden past Alan Fraser in the beechwood. I could not connect it with what I did for Father. It was my delight because I loved him. I did not mind the moods and the irritable outbursts that drove others from him. But now he was dead, and I sat in the sullen dusk wishing that I need not go on with life either. The loneliness of the big echoing house weighed on my spirit. I was solitary, without companionship. I looked out on the outside world where the only sign of human habitation visible to my eye was the light twinkling out from the library window of Glen Ellen on the dark fir hills 2 miles away. By that light I knew Alan Fraser must have returned from his long sojourn abroad, for it only shone when he was at Glen Ellen. He still lived there. Something of a hermit, people said. He had never married, and he cared nothing for society. His companions were books and dogs and horses. He was given to scientific researches and wrote much for the reviews. He travelled a great deal. So much I knew in a vague way. I even saw him occasionally in church, and never thought the years had changed him much, save that his face was sadder and sterner than of old, and his hair had become iron gray. People said that he had inherited and cherished the old hatred of the Shirleys, that he was very bitter against us. I believed it. He had the face of a good hater, or lover, a man who could play with no emotion but must take it in all earnestness and intensity. When it was quite dark, the housekeeper brought in the lights and handed me a letter, which she said a man had just brought up from the village post office. I looked at it curiously before I opened it, wondering from whom it was. It was postmarked from a city several miles away, and the firm decided, rather peculiar handwriting was strange to me. I had no correspondence. After Father's death I had received a few perfunctory notes of condolence from distant relatives and family friends. They had hurt me cruelly, for they seemed to exhale a subtle spirit of congratulation on my being released from a long and unpleasant martyrdom of attendance on an invalid, that quite overrode the decorous phrases of conventional sympathy in which they were expressed. I hated those letters for their implied injustice. I was not thankful for my release. I missed Father miserably, and longed passionately for the very tasks and vigils that had evoked their pity. This letter did not seem like one of those. I opened it and took out some stiff, blackly written sheets. They were undated, and turning to the last I saw that they were unsigned. With a not unpleasant tingling of interest I sat down by my desk to read. The letter began abruptly. "You will not know by whom this is written. Do not seek to know, now or ever. It is only from behind the veil of your ignorance of my identity that I can ever write to you fully and freely as I wish to write, can say what I wish to say in words denied to a formal and conventional expression of sympathy. Dear lady, let me say to you thus what is in my heart. I know what your sorrow is, and I think I know what your loneliness must be. The sorrow of a broken tie, the loneliness of a life thrown emptily back on itself. I know how you loved your father, how you must have loved him if those eyes and brow and mouth speak truth, for they tell of a nature divinely rich and deep, giving of its wealth and tenderness ungrudgingly to those who are so happy as to be of the object of its affection. To such a nature bereavement must bring a depth and an agony of grief unknown to shallower souls. I know what your father's helplessness and need of you meant to you. I know that now life must seem to you a broken and embittered thing, and knowing this, I venture to send this greeting across the gulf of strangerhood between us, telling you that my understanding sympathy is fully and freely yours, and bidding you take heart for the future, which now, it may be, looks so heartless and hopeless to you. Believe me, dear lady, it will be neither. Courage will come to you with the kind days. You will find noble tasks to do, beautiful and gracious duties waiting along your path. The pain and suffering of the world never dies, and while it lives there will be work for such as you to do, and in the doing of it you will find comfort and strength and the highest joy of living. I believe in you. I believe you will make of your life a beautiful and worthy thing. I give you Godspeed for the years to come. Out of my own loneliness, I, an unknown friend, who has never clasped your hand, send this message to you. I understand. I have always understood. And I say to you, be of good cheer. To say that this strange letter was a mystery to me seems an inadequate way of stating the matter. I was completely bewildered, nor could I even guess who the writer might be, think and ponder as I might. The letter itself implied that the writer was a stranger. The handwriting was evidently that of a man, and I knew no man who could or would have sent out such a letter to me. The very mystery stung me to interest. As for the letter itself, it brought me an uplift of hope and inspiration such as I would not have believed possible an hour earlier. It rang so truly and sincerely, and the mere thought that somewhere I had a friend who cared enough to write it, even in such odd fashion, was so sweet that I was half ashamed of the difference it made in my outlook. Sitting there, I took courage and made a compact with myself that I would justify the writer's faith in me, that I would take up my life as something to be worthy lived for all good, to the disregard of my own selfish sorrow and shrinking. I would seek for something to do, for interests which would bind me to my fellow creatures, for tasks which would lessen the pains and perils of humankind. An hour before this would not have seemed to me possible. Now it seemed the right and natural thing to do. A week later another letter came. I welcomed it with an eagerness which I feared was almost childish. It was a much longer letter than the first and was written in quite a different strain. There was no apology for or explanation of the motive for writing. It was as if the letter were merely one of a permitted and established correspondence between old friends. It began with a witty, sparkling review of a new book the writer had just read, and passed from this to crisp comments on great events, political, scientific, artistic, of the day. The whole letter was pungent, interesting, delightful, an impersonal essay on a dozen vital topics of life and thought. Only at the end was a personal note struck. "Are you interested in these things?" ran the last paragraph. "In what is being done and suffered and attained in the great busy world? I think you must be, for I've seen you and read what is written in your face. I believe you care for these things as I do, that your being thrills to the still, sad music of humanity, that the songs of the poets I love find an echo in your spirit, and the aspirations of all struggling souls a sympathy in your heart. Believing this, I have written freely to you, taking a keen pleasure in thus revealing my thoughts and visions to one who will understand. For I, too, am friendless, in the sense of one standing alone, shut out from the sweet, intimate communion of feeling and opinion that may be held with the heart's friends. Shall you have read this as a friend, I wonder, a candid, uncritical, understanding friend? Let me hope it, dear lady." I was expecting the third letter when it came, but not until it did come did I realize what my disappointment would have been if it had not. After that, every week brought me a letter. Soon those letters were the greatest interest in my life. I had given up all attempts to solve the mystery of their coming, and was content to enjoy them for themselves alone. From week to week I look forward to them with an eagerness that I would hardly confess even to myself. And such letters as they were, growing longer and fuller and freer as time went on, such wise, witty, brilliant, pungent letters, stimulating all my torpid life into tingling zest. I'd begun to look abroad, in my small world, for worthy work, and found plenty to do. My unknown friend evidently kept track of my expanding efforts, for he commented and criticized, encouraged and advised freely. There was a humour in his letters that I liked. It leavened them with its sanity and reacted on me most wholesomely, counteracting many of the morbid tendencies and influences of my life. I found myself striving to live up to the writer's ideal of philosophy and ambition, as pictured often unconsciously in his letters. They were an intellectual stimulant as well. To understand them fully, I found it necessary to acquaint myself thoroughly with the literature and art, the science and the politics they touched upon. After every letter there was something new for me to hunt out and learn and assimilate, until my old narrow mental attitude had so broadened and deepened, sweeping out into circles of thought I had never known or imagined, that I hardly knew myself. They had been coming for a year before I began to reply to them. I had often wished to do so. There were so many things I wanted to say and discuss, but it seemed foolish to write letters that could not be sent. One day a letter came that kindled my imagination and stirred my heart and soul so deeply that they insistently demanded answering expression. I sat down at my desk and wrote a full reply to it, safe in the belief that the mysterious friend to whom it was written would never see it. I wrote with a perfect freedom and a total lack of self-consciousness that I could never have attained otherwise. The writing of that letter gave me a pleasure second only to that which the reading of his brought. For the first time I discovered the delight of revealing my thoughts unhindered by the conventions. Also, I understood better why the writer of those letters had written them. Doubtless he had enjoyed doing so, and was not impelled thereto simply by a purely philanthropic wish to help me. When my letter was finished, I sealed it up and locked it away in my desk, with a smile at my middle-aged folly. What, I wondered, would all my sedate, serious friends, my associates of mission and hospital committees, think if they knew? Well, everybody has or should have a pet nonsense in their life. I did not think mine was any sillier than some others I knew, and to myself I admitted that it was very sweet. I knew if those letters ceased to come, all savour would go out of my life. After that I wrote a reply to every letter I received and kept them all locked up together. It was delightful. I wrote out all my doings and perplexities and hopes and plans and wishes, yes, and my dreams. The secret romance of it all made me look on existence with joyous, contented eyes. Gradually a change crept over the letters I received. Without ever affording the slightest clue to the identity of their writer, they grew more intimate and personal. A subtle, caressing note of tenderness breathed from them and thrilled my heart curiously. I felt as if I were being drawn into the writer's life, admitted into the most sacred recesses of his thoughts and feelings. Yet it was all done so subtly, so delicately, that I was unconscious of the change until I discovered it in reading over the older letters and comparing them with the latter ones. Finally a letter came. My first love letter, and surely never was a love letter received under stranger circumstances. It began abruptly as all the letters had begun, plunging into the middle of the writer's strain of thought without any preface. The first words drove the blood to my heart and then sent it flying hotly all over my face. I love you. I must say it at last. Have you not guessed it before? It has trembled on my pen in every line I have written to you, yet I have never dared to shape it into words before. I know not how I dare now. I only know that I must. What a delight to write it out and know that you will read it. Tonight the mood is on me to tell it to you recklessly and lavishly, never pausing to stint or weigh words. Sweetheart, I love you, love you, love you. Dear, true, faithful woman soul, I love you with all the heart of a man. Ever since I first saw you, I have loved you. I can never come to tell you so in spoken words. I can only love you from afar and tell my love under the guise of impersonal friendship. It matters not to you, but it matters more than all else in life to me. I am glad that I love you, dear. Glad, glad, glad." There was much more, for it was a long letter. When I had read it, I buried my burning face in my hands, trembling with happiness. This strange confession of love meant so much to me. My heart leaped forth to meet it with answering love. What mattered it that we could never meet? That I could not even guess who my lover was? Somewhere in the world was a love that was mine alone, and mine wholly, and mine forever. What mattered his name or his station, or the mysterious barrier between us? Spirit leaped to spirit unhindered over the fettering bounds of matter and time. I loved and was beloved. Nothing else mattered. I wrote my answer to his letter. I wrote it fearlessly and unstintedly. Perhaps I could not have written so freely if the letter were to have been read by him. As it was, I poured out the riches of my love as fully as he had done. I kept nothing back, and across the gulf between us I vowed a faithful and enduring love in response to his. The next day I went to town on business with my lawyers. Neither of the members of the firm was in when I called, but I was an old client, and one of the clerks showed me into the private office to wait. As I sat down, my eyes fell on a folded letter lying on the table beside me. With a shock of surprise, I recognized the writing. I could not be mistaken. I should have recognized it anywhere. The letter was lying by its envelope, so folded that only the middle third of the page was visible. An irresistible impulse swept over me. Before I could reflect that I had no business to touch the letter, that perhaps it was unfair to my unknown friend to seek to discover his identity when he wished to hide it, I had turned the letter over and seen the signature. I laid it down again and stood up, dizzy, breathless, unseen. Like a woman in a dream, I walked through the outer office and into the street. I must have walked on for blocks before I became conscious of my surroundings. The name I had seen signed to that letter was Alan Fraser. No doubt the reader has long ago guessed it, has wondered why I had not. The fact remains that I had not. Out of the whole world, Alan Fraser was the last man whom I should have suspected to be the writer of those letters. Alan Fraser, my hereditary enemy, who I had been told cherished the old feud so faithfully and bitterly, and hated our very name. And yet I now wondered at my long blindness. No one else could have written those letters. No one but him. I read them over one by one when I reached home, and now that I possessed the key, he revealed himself in every line, expression, and thought. And he loved me. I thought of the old feud and hatred. I thought of my pride and traditions. They seemed like the dust and ashes of outworn things, things to be smiled at and cast aside. I took out all the letters I had written, all except the last one, sealed them up in a parcel, and directed it to Alan Fraser. Then, summoning my groom, I bade him ride to Glen Ellen with it. His look of amazement almost made me laugh, but after he was gone I felt dizzy and frightened at my own daring. When the autumn darkness came down, I went to my room and dressed as the woman dresses who awaits the one man of all the world. I hardly knew what I hoped or expected, but I was all athrill with the nameless, inexplicable happiness. I admit I looked very eagerly into the mirror when I was done, and I thought that the result was not unpleasing. Beauty had never been mine, but a faint reflection of it came over me in the tremulous flush and excitement of the moment. Then the maid came up to tell me that Alan Fraser was in the library. I went down with my cold hands tightly clasped behind me. He was standing by the library table, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with the light striking upward on his dark, sensitive face and iron-gray hair. When he saw me, he came quickly forward. "So you know, and you're not angry? Your letters told me so much. I have loved you since that day in the beechwood, Isabel. Isabel." His eyes were kindling into mine. He held my hands in a close, impetuous clasp. His voice was infinitely caressing as he pronounced my name. I had never heard it since Father died. I had never heard it at all so musically and tenderly uttered. My ancestors might have turned in their graves just then, but it mattered not. Living love had driven out dead hatred. "Isabel," he went on, "there was one letter unanswered, the last." I went to my desk, took out the last letter I had written, and gave it to him in silence. While he read it, I stood in a shadowy corner and watched him, wondering if life could always be as sweet as this. When he had finished, he turned to me and held out his arms. I went to them as a bird to her nest. and with his lips against mine, the old feud was blotted out forever. End of the letters. Story number 21 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, May 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Life Book of Uncle Jesse. Uncle Jesse? The name calls up the vision of him as I saw him so often in those 2 enchanted summers at Golden Gate. As I saw him the first time, when he stood in the open doorway of the little low-eaved cottage on the harbour shore, welcoming us to our new domicile with the gentle, unconscious courtesy that became him so well. A tall, ungainly figure, somewhat stooped, yet suggestive of great strength and endurance. A clean-shaven old face, deeply lined and bronzed. A thick mane of iron-grey hair falling quite to his shoulders, and a pair of remarkably blue, deep-set eyes, which sometimes twinkled and sometimes dreamed, but oftener looked out seaward with a wistful question in them, as of one seeking something precious and lost. I was to learn one day what it was for which Uncle Jesse looked. It cannot be denied that Uncle Jesse was a homely man. His spare jaws, rugged mouth, and square brow were not fashioned on the lines of beauty, but though at first sight you thought him plain, you never thought anything more about it. The spirit shining through that rugged tenement beautified it so wholly. Uncle Jesse was quite keenly aware of his lack of outward comeliness, and lamented it, for he was a passionate worshipper of beauty in everything. He told Mother once that he'd rather like to be made over again, and made handsome. "Folks say I'm good," he remarked whimsically, "but I sometimes wish the Lord had made me only half as good, and put the rest of it into looks. But I reckon he knew what he was about, as a good captain should. Some of us have to be homely, or the pretty ones, like Miss Mary there, wouldn't show up so well." I was not in the least pretty, but Uncle Jesse was always telling me I was, and I loved him for it. He told the fib so prettily and sincerely that he almost made me believe it for the time being, and I really think he believed it himself. All women were lovely and of good report in his eyes, because of one he had loved. The only time I ever saw Uncle Jesse really angered was when someone in his hearing cast an aspersion on the character of a shore girl. The wretched man who did it fairly cringed when Uncle Jesse turned on him with lightning of eye and thundercloud of brow. At that moment I no longer found it hard to reconcile Uncle Jesse's simple, kindly personality with the wild, adventurous life he had lived. We went to Golden Gate in the spring. Mother's health had not been good, and her doctor recommended sea air and quiet. Uncle James, when he heard it, proposed that we take possession of a small cottage at Golden Gate, to which he had recently fallen heir by the death of an old aunt who had lived in it. "I haven't been up to see it," he said, "but it is just as Aunt Elizabeth left it, and she was the pink of neatness. The key is in the possession of an old sailor living near by. Jesse Boyd is the name, I think. I imagine you can be very comfortable in it. It is built right on the harbour shore, inside the bar, and it is within 5 minutes' walk of the outside shore." Uncle James's offer fitted in very opportunely with our limp family purse, and we straightway betook ourselves to Golden Gate. We telegraphed to Jesse Boyd to have the house opened for us, and one crisp spring day, when a rollicking wind was scudding over the harbour and the dunes, whipping the water into white caps and washing the sandshore with long lines of silvery breakers, we alighted at the little station and walked the half-mile to our new home, leaving our goods and chattels to be carted over in the evening by an obliging station agent's boy. Our first glimpse of Aunt Elizabeth's cottage was a delight to soul and sense. It looked so like a big grey seashell stranded on the shore. Between it and the harbour was only a narrow strip of shingle, and behind it was a gnarled and battered fir wood, where the winds were in the habit of harping all sorts of weird and haunting music. Inside it was to prove even yet more quaint and delightful, with its low, dark beamed ceilings and square, deep-set windows, by which Whether open or shut, sea breezes entered at their own sweet will. The view from our door was magnificent, taking in the big harbour and sweeps of purple hills beyond. The entrance of the harbour gave it its name, a deep, narrow channel between the bar of sand dunes on the one side and a steep, high, frowning red sandstone cliff on the other. We appreciated its significance the first time we saw a splendid golden sunrise flooding it, coming out of the wonderful sea and sky beyond and billowing through that narrow passage in waves of light. Truly, it was a golden gate through which one might sail to fairylands forlorn. As we went along the path to our little house, we were agreeably surprised to see a blue spiral of smoke curling up from its big square chimney, and the next moment Uncle Jesse, we were calling him Uncle Jesse half an hour after we met him, so it seemed scarcely worth while to begin with anything else, came to the door. "Welcome, ladies," he said, holding out a big, hard but scrupulously clean hand. "I thought you'd be feeling a bit tired and hungry, maybe, so when I came over to open up, I put on a fire and brewed you up a cup of tea. I just delight in being neighbourly, and 'tain't often I have the chance." We found that Uncle Jesse's cup of tea meant a veritable spread. He had aired the little dining room, set out the table daintily with Aunt Elizabeth's china and linen, knowed just where to put my hands on 'em, often and often helped old Miss Kennedy wash 'em. We were cronies, her and me. I miss her terrible, and adorned it with mayflowers which, as we afterward discovered, he had tramped several miles to gather. There was good bread and butter, store biscuits, a dish of tea fit for the gods on high Olympus, and a platter of the most delicious sea trout done to a turn. "Thought they'd be tasty after travelling," said Uncle Jesse. "They're fresh as trout can be, ma'am. 2 hours ago they was swimming in Johnson's pond yonder. I caught 'em. Yes, ma'am. It's about all I'm good for now, catching trout and cod occasional. But 'tweren't always so, not by no manner of means. I used to do other things, as you'd admit if you saw my life book." I was so hungry and tired that I did not then rise to the bait of Uncle Jesse's life book. I simply wanted to begin on those trout. Mother insisted that Uncle Jesse sit down and help us eat the repast he had prepared, and he assented without undue coaxing. "Thank ye kindly. 'Twill be a real treat. I mostly has to eat my meals alone, with the reflection of my ugly old phiz in a looking-glass opposite for company. 'Tisn't often I have the chance to sit down with two such sweet, purty ladies." Uncle Jesse's compliments looked bald enough on paper, but he paid them with such gracious, gentle deference of tone and look that the woman who received them felt that she was being offered a queen's gift in kingly fashion. He broke bread with us, and from that moment we were all friends together and forever. After we had eaten all we could, we sat at our table for an hour and listened to Uncle Jesse telling us stories of his life. "If I talk too much, you must just check me," he said seriously, but with a twinkle in his eyes. "When I do get a chance to talk to anyone, I'm apt to run on terrible." He had been a sailor from the time he was 10 years old, and some of his adventures had such a marvellous edge that I secretly wondered if Uncle Jesse were not drawing a rather long bow at our credulous expense. But in this, as I found later, I did him injustice. His tales were all literally true, and Uncle Jesse had the gift of the born storyteller, whereby unhappy, far-off things can be brought vividly before the hearer and made to live again in all their pristine poignancy. Mother and I laughed and shivered over Uncle Jesse's tales, and once we found ourselves crying. Uncle Jesse surveyed our tears with pleasure, shining out through his face like an illuminating lamp. "I like to make folks cry that way," he remarked. "It's a compliment, but I can't do justice to the things I've seen and helped do. I've got 'em all jotted down in my life book, but I haven't got the knack of writing them out properly. If I had, I could make a great book. If I had the knack of hitting on just the right words and stringing everything together proper on paper, but I can't. It's in this poor human critter." Uncle Jesse patted his breast sorrowfully. "But he can't get it out." When Uncle Jesse went home that evening, Mother asked him to come often to see us. "I wonder if you'd give that invitation if you knew how likely I'd be to accept it," he remarked whimsically. "Which is another way of saying you wonder if I meant it," smiled Mother. "I do most heartily and sincerely." "Then I'll come. You'll likely be pestered with me at any hour, and I'd be proud to have you drop over to visit me now and then, too. I live on that point yonder. Neither me nor my house is worth coming to see. It's only got one room and a loft and a stovepipe sticking out of the roof for a chimney. But I've got a few little things lying around that I picked up in the queer corners I used to be poking my nose into. Maybe they'd interest you." Uncle Jesse's few little things turned out to be the most interesting collection of curios I had ever seen. His one neat little living room was full of them, beautiful, hideous, or quaint, as the case might be, and almost all having some weird or exciting story attached. Mother and I had a beautiful summer at Golden Gate. We lived the life of two children with Uncle Jesse as a playmate. Our housekeeping was of the simplest description, and we spent our hours rambling along the shores, reading on the rocks or sailing over the harbour in Uncle Jesse's trim little boat. Every day we loved the simple-souled, true, manly old sailor more and more. He was as refreshing as a sea breeze, as interesting as some ancient chronicle. We never tired of listening to his stories, and his quaint remarks and comments were a continual delight to us. Uncle Jesse was one of those interesting and rare people who, in the picturesque phraseology of the shore folks, never speak, but they say something. The milk of human kindness and the wisdom of the serpent were mingled in Uncle Jesse's composition in delightful proportions. One day he was absent all day and returned at nightfall. "Took a tramp back yonder." Back yonder with Uncle Jesse might mean the station hamlet or the city 100 miles away, or any place between. "To carry Mr. Campbell and Miss a trout. He likes one occasional, and it's all I can do for a kindness he did me once. I stayed all day to talk to him. He likes to talk to me, though he's an educated man, because he's one of the folks that's got to talk or they're miserable, and he finds listeners scarce round here. The folks fight shy of him because they think he's an infidel. He ain't that far gone exactly. Few men is, I reckon, but he's what you might call a heretic. Heretics are wicked, but they're mighty interesting. It's just that they've got sorter lost looking for God, being under the impression that it's hard to find, which he ain't never. Most of 'em blunder to him after a while, I guess. I don't think listening to Mr. Kimball's arguments is likely to do me much harm. Mind you, I believe what I was brought up to believe. It saves a vast of trouble, and back of it all, God is good. The trouble with Mr. Kimball is he's a leetle too clever. He thinks he's bound to live up to his cleverness, and that it's smarter to thrash out some new way of getting to heaven than to go by the old track the common, ignorant folks is travelling. But he'll get there sometime, all right, and then he'll laugh at himself." Nothing ever seemed to put Uncle Jesse out or depress him in any way. "I've kind of contracted a habit of enjoying things," he remarked once, when Mother had commented on his invariable cheerfulness. "It's got so chronic that I believe I even enjoy the disagreeable things. It's great fun thinking they can't last. 'Old rheumatiz,' I says, when it grips me hard, 'you've got to stop aching sometime. The worse you are, the sooner you'll stop, perhaps. I'm bound to get the better of you in the long run, whether in the body or out of the body.'" Uncle Jesse seldom came to our house without bringing us something, even if it were only a bunch of sweetgrass. "I favoured the smell of sweetgrass," he said. "It always made me think of my mother." "Oh, she was fond of it." "Not that I knows on. Dunno's she's ever saw any sweetgrass. No, it's because it has a kind of motherly perfume. Not too young, you understand. Something kind of seasoned and wholesome and dependable, just like a mother." Uncle Jesse was a very early riser. He seldom missed a sunrise. "I've seen all kinds of sunrises come in through that there gate," he said dreamily one morning, when I myself had made a heroic effort at early rising and joined him on the rocks halfway between his house and ours. "I've been all over the world, and, take it all in all, I've never seen a finer sight than a summer sunrise out there beyont the gate. A man can't pick his time for dying, Mary. Just got to go when the captain gives his sailing orders. But if I could, I'd go out when the morning comes in there at the gate. I've watched it a many times and thought what a thing it would be to pass out through that great white glory to whatever was waiting beyond, on a sea that ain't mapped out on any earthly chart. I think, Mary, I'd find lost Margaret there." He had already told me the story of lost Margaret, as he always called her. He rarely spoke of her, but when he did, his love for her trembled in every tone, a love that had never grown faint or forgetful. Uncle Jesse was 70. It was 50 years since lost Margaret had fallen asleep one day in her father's dory and drifted, as was supposed, for nothing was ever known certainly of her fate, across the harbour and out of the gate, to perish in the black thunder squall that had come up suddenly that long ago afternoon. But to Uncle Jesse those 50 years were but as yesterday when it is past. "I walked the shore for months after that," he said sadly, "looking to find her dear, sweet little body, but the sea never gave her back to me. But I'll find her sometime. I wished I could tell you just how she looked, but I can't. I've seen a fine silvery mist hanging over the gate at sunrise that seemed like her, and then again I'd seen a white birch in the woods back yonder that made me think of her. She had pale brown hair and a little white face, and long slender fingers like yours, Mary, only browner, for she was a shore girl. Sometimes I wake up in the night and hear the sea calling to me in the old way, and it seems as if lost Margaret called in it. And when there's a storm and the waves are sobbing and moaning, I hear her lamenting among them. And when they laugh on a gay day, it's her laugh, lost Margaret's sweet little laugh. The sea took her from me, but some day I'll find her, Mary. Can't keep us apart forever." I had not been long at Golden Gate before I saw Uncle Jesse's life book, as he quaintly called it. He needed no coaxing to show it, and he proudly gave it to me to read. It was an old leather-bound book filled with the record of his voyages and adventures. I thought what a veritable treasure trove it would be to a writer. Every sentence was a nugget. In itself the book had no literary merit. Uncle Jesse's charm of storytelling failed him when he came to pen and ink. He could only jot down roughly the outline of his famous tales, and both spelling and grammar were sadly askew. But I felt that if anyone possessing the gift could take that simple record of a brave, adventurous life, reading between the bald lines the tale of dangers staunchly faced and duties manfully done, a wonderful story might be made from it. Pure comedy and thrilling tragedy were both lying hidden in Uncle Jesse's life book, waiting for the touch of the magician's hand to waken the laughter and grief and horror of thousands. I thought of my cousin Robert Kennedy, who juggled with words in a masterly fashion, but complained that he found it hard to create incidents or characters. Here were both ready to his hand, but Robert was in Japan in the interests of his paper. In the fall, when the harbour lay black and sullen under November skies, Mother and I went back to town, parting with Uncle Jesse regretfully. We wanted him to visit us in town during the winter, but he shook his head. "It's too far away, Mary. If lost Margaret called me, I mightn't hear her there. I must be here when my time comes. It can't be very far off now." I wrote often to Uncle Jesse through the winter, and sent him books and magazines. He enjoyed them, but he thought, and truly enough, that none of them came up to his life book for real interest. "If my life book could be took and ripped by someone that knowed how, it would beat them holler," he wrote in one of his few letters to me. In the spring we returned joyfully to Golden Gate. It was as golden as ever, and the harbour as blue. The wind still rollicked as gaily and sweetly, and the breakers boomed outside the bar as of yore. All was unchanged, save Uncle Jesse. He had aged greatly and seemed frail and bent. After he had gone home from his first call on us, Mother cried. "Uncle Jesse will soon be going to seek lost Margaret," she said. In June Robert came. I took him promptly over to see Uncle Jesse, who was very much excited when he found that Robert was a real writing man. "Robert wanted to hear some of your stories, Uncle Jesse," I said. "Tell him the one about the captain who went crazy and imagined he was the Flying Dutchman." This was Uncle Jesse's best story. It was a compound of humour and horror, and though I had heard it several times, I laughed as heartily and shivered as fearsomely over it as Robert did. Other tales followed. Uncle Jesse told how his vessel had been run down by a steamer, how he had been boarded by Malay pirates, how his ship had caught fire, how he had helped a political prisoner escape from a South American republic. He never said a boastful word, but it was impossible to help seeing what a hero the man had been. Brave, true, resourceful, unselfish, skillful. He sat there in his poor little room and made those things live again for us. By a lift of the eyebrow, a twist of the lip, a gesture, a word, he painted some whole scene or character so that we saw it as it was. Finally, he lent Robert his life book. Robert sat up all night reading it and came to the breakfast table in great excitement. "Mary, this is a wonderful book. If I could take it and garb it properly, work it up into a systematic whole and string it on the thread of Uncle Jesse's Romance of Lost Margaret. It would be the novel of the year. Do you suppose he would let me do it?" "Let you? I think he would be delighted," I answered. And he was. He was as excited as a schoolboy over it. At last his cherished dream was to be realized and his life book given to the world. "We'll collaborate," said Robert. "You will give the soul and I the body. Oh, we'll write a famous book between us, Uncle Jesse, and we'll get right to work." Uncle Jesse was a happy man that summer. He looked upon the little back room we gave up to Robert for his study as a sacred shrine. Robert talked everything over with Uncle Jesse, but would not let him see the manuscript. "You must wait till it is published," he said. "Then you'll get it all at once in its best shape." Robert delved into the treasures of the life book and used them freely. He dreamed and brooded over lost Margaret until she became a vivid reality to him and lived in his pages. As the book progressed, it took possession of him, and he worked at it with feverish eagerness. He let me read the manuscript and criticize it, and the concluding chapter of the book, which the critics later on were pleased to call idyllic, were modelled after my suggestions, so that I felt as if I had a share in it too. It was autumn when the book was finished. Robert went back to town, but Mother and I decided to stay at Golden Gate all winter. We loved the spot, and besides, I wished to remain for Uncle Jesse's sake. He was failing all the time, and after Robert went and the excitement of the bookmaking was past, he failed still more rapidly. His tramping expeditions were over, and he seldom went out in his boat. Neither did he talk a great deal. He liked to come over and sit silently for hours at our seaward window, looking out wistfully toward the gate with his swiftly whitening head leaning on his hand. The only keen interest he still had was in Robert's book. He waited and watched impatiently for its publication. "I want to live till I see it," he said. "Just that long. Then I'll be ready to go. He said it would be out in the spring. I must hang on till it comes, Mary." There were times when I doubted sadly if he would hang on. As the winter wore away, he grew frailer and frailer, but ever he looked forward to the coming of spring and the book, his book, transformed and glorified. One day in young April the book came at last. Uncle Jesse had gone to the post office faithfully every day for a month, expecting it, but this day he was too feeble to go, and I went for him. The book was there. It was called simply The Life Book of Jesse Boyd, and on the title page the names of Robert Kennedy and Jesse Boyd were printed as collaborators. I shall never forget Uncle Jesse's face as I handed it to him. I came away and left him reading it, oblivious to all else. All night the light burned in his window, and I looked out across the sands to it and pictured the delight of the old man poring over the printed pages whereon his own life was portrayed. I wondered how he would like the ending I had suggested. I was never to know. After breakfast I went over to Uncle Jesse's house, taking some little delicacy Mother had cooked for him. It was an exquisite morning, full of delicate spring tints and sounds. The harbour was sparkling and dimpling like a girl. The winds were playing hide and seek roguishly among the stunted firs, and the silver flashing gulls were soaring over the bar. Beyond the gate was a shining, wonderful sea. When I reached the little house on the point, I saw the lamp still burning wanly in the window. A quick alarm struck at my heart. Without waiting to knock, I lifted the latch and entered. Uncle Jesse was lying on the old sofa by the window, with the book clasped to his heart. His eyes were closed, and on his face was a look of the most perfect peace and happiness, the look of one who has long sought and found at last. We could not know at what hour he had died, but somehow I think he had his wish and went out when the morning came in through the Golden Gate. Out on that shining tide his spirit drifted, over the sunrise sea of pearl and silver, to the haven where lost Margaret waited beyond the storms and calms. End of The Life Book of Uncle Jesse. Story number 22 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, May 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Little Black Doll. Everybody in the Marshall household was excited on the evening of the concert at the Harbour Light Hotel. Everybody, even to little Joyce, who couldn't go to the concert because there wasn't anybody else to stay with Denise. Perhaps Denise was the most excited of them all. Denise, who was slowly dying of consumption in the Marshall kitchen chamber because there was no other place in the world for her to die in, or anybody to trouble about her. Mrs. Roderick Marshall thought it very good of herself to do so much for Denise. To be sure, Denise was not much bother, and little Joyce did most of the waiting on her. At the tea table nothing was talked of but the concert, for was not Madame Laurin, the great French-Canadian prima donna, at the hotel, and was she not going to sing? It was the opportunity of a lifetime. The Marshalls would not have missed it for anything. Stately, handsome old Grandmother Marshall was going, and Uncle Roderick, and Aunt Isabella, and of course Chrissy, who was always taken everywhere because she was pretty and graceful and everything that little Joyce was not. Little Joyce would have liked to go to the concert, for she was very fond of music, and besides, she wanted to be able to tell Denise all about it. But when you're shy and homely and thin and awkward, your grandmother never takes you anywhere. At least such was little Joyce's belief. Little Joyce knew quite well that Grandmother Marshall did not like her. She thought it was because she was so plain and awkward, and in part it was. Grandmother Marshall cared very little for granddaughters who did not do her credit. But little Joyce's mother had married a poor man in the face of her family's disapproval, and then both she and her husband had been inconsiderate enough to die and leave a small orphan without a penny to support her. Grandmother Marshall fed and clothed the child, but who could make anything of such a shy creature with no gifts or graces whatever? Grandmother Marshall had no intention of trying. Chrissy, the golden-haired and pink-cheeked, was Grandmother Marshall's pet. Little Joyce knew this. She did not envy Chrissy, but oh, how she wished Grandmother Marshall would love her a little too. Nobody loved her but Denise and the little black doll. And little Joyce was beginning to understand that Denise would not be in the kitchen chamber very much longer, and the little black doll couldn't tell you she loved you, although she did, of course. Little Joyce had no doubt at all on this point. Little Joyce sighed so deeply over this thought that Uncle Roderick smiled at her. Uncle Roderick did smile at her sometimes. "What is the matter, little Joyce?" he asked. "I was thinking about my black doll," said little Joyce timidly. "Ah, your black doll. If Madame Laurin were to see it, she'd likely want it. She makes a hobby of collecting dolls all over the world. But I doubt if she has in her collection a doll that served to amuse a little girl 4,000 years ago in the court of the Pharaohs." "I think Joyce's black doll is very ugly," said Chrissy. "My wax doll with the yellow hair is ever so much prettier." "My black doll isn't ugly," cried little Joyce indignantly. She could endure to be called ugly herself, but she could not bear to have her darling black doll called ugly. In her excitement she upset her cup of tea over the tablecloth. Aunt Isabella looked angry, and Grandmother Marshall said sharply, "Joyce, leave the table. You grow more awkward and careless every day." Little Joyce, on the verge of tears, crept away and went up the kitchen stairs to Denise to be comforted. But Denise herself had been crying. She lay on her little bed by the low window, where the glow of the sunset was coming in. Her hollow cheeks were scarlet with fever. "Oh, I want so much to hear Madame Laurin sing," she sobbed. "I feel like I could die easier if I hear her sing just one leetle song. She is Frenchwoman too, and she sing all de old French songs, de old songs my mudder sing long ago. Oh, I so want to hear Madame Laurin sing." "But you can't, dear Denise," said little Joyce very softly, stroking Denise's hot forehead with her cool, slender hand. Little Joyce had very pretty hands, only nobody had ever noticed them. "You're not strong enough to go to the concert. I'll sing for you, if you like. Of course, I can't sing very well, but I'll do my best." "You sing like a sweet bird, but you are not Madame Laurin," said Denise restlessly. "It is de great Madame I want to hear. I have not long to live. Oh, I know, little Joyce. I know what the doctor look like, and I want to hear Madame Laurin sing 'fore I die. I know it is impossible, but I long for it so. Just one little song." Denise put her thin hands over her face and sobbed again. Little Joyce went and sat down by the window, looking out into the white birches. Her heart ached bitterly. Dear Denise was going to die soon. Oh, very soon. Little Joyce, wise and knowing beyond her years, saw that. And Denise wanted to hear Madame Laurin sing. It seemed a foolish thing to think of, but Little Joyce thought hard about it, and when she had finished thinking, she got her little black doll and took it to bed with her, and there she cried herself to sleep. At the breakfast table next morning, the Marshalls talked about the concert and the wonderful Madame Laurin. Little Joyce listened in her usual silence. Her crying the night before had not improved her looks any. Never, thought handsome Grandmother Marshall, had she appeared so sallow and homely. Really, Grandmother Marshall could not have the patience to look at her. She decided that she would not take Joyce driving with her and Chrissy that afternoon, as she had thought of, after all. In the forenoon it was discovered that Denise was much worse, and the doctor was sent for. He came and shook his head, that being really all he could do under the circumstances. When he went away, he was waylaid at the back door by a small gypsy with big black serious eyes and long black hair. "Is Denise going to die?" Little Joyce asked in the blunt, straightforward fashion Grandmother Marshall found so trying. The doctor looked at her from under his shaggy brows, and decided that here was one of the people to whom you might as well tell the truth first as last, because they are bound to have it. "Yes," he said, "soon. Very soon, I'm afraid. In a few days at most." "Thank you," said Little Joyce gravely. She went to her room and did something with the black doll. She did not cry, but if you could have seen her face, you would have wished she would cry. After dinner, Grandmother Marshall and Chrissy drove away, and Uncle Roderick and Aunt Isabella went away too. Little Joyce crept up to the kitchen chamber. Denise was lying in an uneasy sleep with tear stains on her face. Then Little Joyce tiptoed down and sped away to the hotel. She did not know just what she would say or do when she got there, but she thought hard all the way to the end of the shore road. When she came out to the shore, a lady was sitting alone on a big rock, a lady with a dark, beautiful face and wonderful eyes. Little Joyce stopped before her and looked at her meditatively. Perhaps it would be well to ask advice of this lady. "If you please," said Little Joyce, who was never shy with strangers, for whose opinion she didn't care at all. "I want to see Madame Laurin at the hotel and ask her to do me a very great favour. Will you tell me the best way to go about seeing her? I shall be much obliged to you." "What is the favour you want to ask of Madame Laurin?" inquired the lady, smiling. "I want to ask her if she will come and sing for Denise before she dies. Before Denise dies, I mean. Denise is our French girl, and the doctor says she cannot live very long, and she wishes with all her heart to hear Madame Laurin sing. It is very bitter, you know, to be dying and want something very much and not be able to get it." "Do you think Madame Laurin will go?" asked the lady. "I don't know. I am going to offer her my little black doll. If she will not come for that, there is nothing else I can do." A flash of interest lighted up the lady's brown eyes. She bent forward. "Is it your doll you have in that box? Will you let me see it?" Little Joyce nodded. Mutely she opened the box and took out the black doll. The lady gave an exclamation of amazed delight and almost snatched it from Little Joyce. It was a very peculiar little doll indeed, carved out of some black polished wood. "Child, where in the world did you get this?" she cried. "Father got it out of a grave in Egypt," said Little Joyce. "It was buried with the mummy of a little girl who lived 4,000 years ago, Uncle Roderick says. She must have loved her doll very much to have had it buried with her, mustn't she? But she could not have loved it any more than I do." "And yet you're going to give it away?" said the lady, looking at her keenly. "For Denise's sake," explained Little Joyce. "I would do anything for Denise, because I love her and she loves me. When the only person in the world who loves you is going to die, there is nothing you would not do for her if you could. Denise was so good to me before she took sick. She used to kiss me and play with me and make little cakes for me and tell me beautiful stories." The lady put the little black doll back in the box. Then she stood up and held out her hand. "Come," she said. "I am Madame Laurin, and I shall go and sing for Denise." Little Joyce piloted Madame Laurin home and into the kitchen and up the back stairs to the kitchen chamber, a proceeding which would have filled Aunt Isabella with horror if she had known. But Madame Laurin did not seem to mind, and Little Joyce never thought about it at all. It was Little Joyce's awkward, unmarshal-like fashion to go to a place by the shortest way there, even if it was up the kitchen stairs. Madame Laurin stood in the bare little room and looked pityingly at the wasted, wistful face on the pillow. "This is Madame Laurin, and she's going to sing for you, Denise," whispered Little Joyce. Denise's face lighted up, and she clasped her hands. "If you please," she said faintly, "a French song, madame. The old French song dey sing long ago." Then did Madame Laurin sing. Never had that kitchen chamber been so filled with glorious melody. Song after song she sang, the old folklore songs of the habitat, the songs perhaps that Evangeline listened to in her childhood. Little Joyce knelt by the bed, her eyes on the singer like one entranced. Denise lay with her face full of joy and rapture, such joy and rapture. Little Joyce did not regret the sacrifice of her black doll, never could regret it, as long as she remembered Denise's look. "Thank you, madam," said Denise brokenly, when madam ceased. "Dat was so beautiful, de angel. Dey cannot sing more sweet. I love music so much, madam. Leetle Joyce, she sing to me often and often. She sing sweet, but not like you. Oh, not like you." "Little Joyce must sing for me," said madam, smiling as she sat down by the window. "I always like to hear fresh, childish voices. Will you, Little Joyce?" Oh, yes. Little Joyce was quite unembarrassed and perfectly willing to do anything she could for this wonderful woman who had brought that look to Denise's face. "I will sing as well as I can for you. Of course I can't sing very well, and I don't know anything but hymns. I always sing hymns for Denise, although she is a Catholic and the hymns are Protestant. But her priest told her it was all right because all music was of God. Denise's priest is a very nice man, and I like him. He thought my little black doll, your little black doll, was splendid. I'll sing 'Lead Kindly Light.' That is Denise's favorite hymn." Then Little Joyce, slipping her hand into Denise's, began to sing. At the first note, Madame Laurin, who had been gazing out of the window with a rather listless smile, turned quickly and looked at Little Joyce with amazed eyes. Delight followed amazement, and when Little Joyce had finished, the great madam rose impulsively, her face and eyes glowing, stepped swiftly to Little Joyce, and took the thin, dark face between her gemmed hands. "Child, do you know what a wonderful voice you have? What a marvelous voice! It is, I never heard such a voice in a child of your age. Mine was nothing to it, nothing at all. You will be a great singer some day, far greater than I. Yes, but you must have the training. Where are your parents? I must see them." "I have no parents," said the bewildered Little Joyce. "I belong to Grandmother Marshall, and she is out driving." "Then I shall wait until your Grandmother Marshall comes home from her drive," said Madame Laurin decidedly. Half an hour later a very much surprised old lady was listening to Madame Laurin's enthusiastic statements. "How is it I have never heard you sing, if you can sing so well?" asked Grandmother Marshall, looking at Little Joyce with something in her eye that had never been in them before, as Little Joyce instantly felt to the core of her sensitive soul. But Little Joyce hung her head. It had never occurred to her to sing to Grandmother Marshall's presence. "This child must be trained by and by," said Madame Laurin. "If you cannot afford it, Mrs. Marshall, I will see to it. Such a voice must not be wasted." "Thank you, Madame Laurin," said Grandmother Marshall with a gracious dignity, "but I am quite able to give my granddaughter all the necessary advantages for the development of her gift, and I thank you very much for telling me of it." Madame Laurin bent and kissed Little Joyce's brown cheeks. "Little gypsy, good-bye, but come every day to this hotel to see me. And next summer I shall be back. I like you because some day you will be a great singer, and because today you are a loving, unselfish baby." "You have forgotten the little black doll, madam," said Little Joyce gravely. Madam threw up her hands, laughing. "No, no, I shall not take your little black doll of the 4,000 years. Keep it for a mascot. A great singer always needs a mascot. But do not, I command you, take it out of the box till I am gone, for if I were to see it again, I might not be able to resist the temptation. Some day I shall show you my dolls. There is not such a gem among them." When Madame Laurin had gone, Grandmother Marshall looked at Little Joyce. "Come to my room, Joyce. I want to see if we cannot find a more becoming way of arranging your hair. It has grown so thick and long. I had no idea how thick and long. Yes, we must certainly find a better way than that stiff braid. Come." Little Joyce, taking Grandmother Marshall's extended hand, felt very happy. She realized that this strange, stately old woman, who never liked little girls unless they were pretty or graceful or clever, was beginning to love her at last. End of The Little Black Doll. Story number 23 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Man on the Train. When the telegram came from William George, Grandma Sheldon was all alone with Cyrus and Louise, and Cyrus and Louise, aged respectively 12 and 11, were not very much good, Grandma thought, when it came to advising what was to be done. Grandma was all in a flutter. Dear, oh dear, as she said. The telegram said that Delia, William George's wife, was seriously ill down at Green Village, and William George wanted Samuel to bring Grandma down immediately. Delia had always thought there was nobody like Grandma when it came to nursing sick folks. But Samuel and his wife were both away, had been away for 2 days and intended to be away for 5 more. They had driven to Sinclair, 20 miles away, to visit with Miss Samuel's folks for a week. Dear, oh dear, what shall I do? Said Grandma. Go right to Green Village on the evening train, said Cyrus briskly. Dear, oh dear, and leave you two alone? Cried Grandma. Louise and I will do very well until tomorrow, said Cyrus sturdily. We will send word to Sinclair by today's mail, and Father and Mother will be home by tomorrow night. But I never was on the cars in my life, protested Grandma nervously. I'm so frightened to start alone, and you never know what kind of people you may meet on the train. You'll be all right, Grandma. I'll drive you to the station, get you your ticket, and put you on the train. Then you'll have nothing to do until the train gets to Green Village. I'll send a telegram to Uncle William George to meet you. I shall fall and break my neck getting off the train, said Grandma pessimistically, but she was wondering at the same time whether she had better take the black valise or the yellow, and whether William George would be likely to have plenty of flaxseed in the house. It was 6 miles to the station, and Cyrus drove Grandma over in time to catch a train that reached Green Village at 9 o'clock. Dear, oh dear, said Grandma. What if William George's folks ain't there to meet me? It's all very well, Cyrus, to say that they will be there, but you don't know. And it's all very well to say not to be nervous because everything will be all right. If you were 75 years old and had never set foot on the cars in your life, you'd be nervous too. And you can't be sure that everything will be all right. You never know what sort of people you'll meet on the train. I may get on the wrong train or lose my ticket or get carried past Green Village or get my pocket picked. Well, no, I won't do that, for not 1 cent will I carry with me. You shall take back home all the money you don't need to get my ticket. Then I shall be easier in my mind. Dear, oh dear, if it wasn't that Delia so seriously ill, I wouldn't go 1 step. Oh, you'll be all right, Grandma assured Cyrus. He got Grandma's ticket for her, and Grandma tied it up in the corner of her handkerchief. Then the train came in, and Grandma, clinging closely to Cyrus, was put on it. Cyrus found a comfortable seat for her and shook hands cheerily. Good-bye, Grandma. Don't be frightened. Here's the Weekly Argus. I got it at the store. You may like to look over it. Then Cyrus was gone, and in a minute the station house and platform began to glide away. Dear, oh dear, what has happened to it? Thought Grandma in dismay. The next moment she exclaimed aloud, Why, it's us that's moving, not it. Some of the passengers smiled pleasantly at Grandma. She was a variety of old lady at which people do smile pleasantly. A Grandma with round pink cheeks, soft brown eyes, and lovely snow white curls, and a nice person to look at wherever she is found. After a while, Grandma, to her amazement, discovered that she liked riding on the cars. It was not at all the disagreeable experience she had expected it to be. Why, she was just as comfortable as if she were in her own rocking chair at home. And there was such a lot of people to look at, and many of the ladies had such beautiful dresses and hats. After all, the people you meet on a train, thought Grandma, are surprisingly like the people you meet off it. If it had not been for wondering how she would get off at the Green Village, Grandma would have enjoyed herself thoroughly. 4 or 5 stations farther on, the train halted at a lonely-looking place consisting of the station house and a barn, surrounded by scrub woods and a blueberry barrens. One passenger got on, and finding only one vacant seat in the crowded car, sat right down beside Grandma Sheldon. Grandma Sheldon held her breath while she looked him over. Was he a pickpocket? He didn't appear like one, but you can never be sure the people you meet on the train. Grandma remembered with a sigh of thankfulness that she had no money. Besides, he seemed really very respectable and harmless. He was quietly dressed in a suit of dark blue serge with a black overcoat. He wore his hat well down on his forehead and was clean shaven. His hair was very black, but his eyes were blue. Nice eyes, Grandma thought. She always felt great confidence in a man who had bright, open blue eyes. Grandpa Sheldon, who had died so long ago, 4 years after their marriage, had had bright blue eyes. To be sure, he had fair hair, reflected Grandma. It's real odd to see such black hair with such light blue eyes. Well, he's real nice looking, and I don't believe there's a mite of harm in him. The early autumn night had now fallen, and Grandma could not amuse herself by watching the scenery. She bethought herself of the paper Cyrus had given her and took it out of her basket. It was an old weekly, a fortnight back. On the first page was a long account of a murder case with scare heads, and into this Grandma plunged eagerly. Sweet old Grandma Sheldon, who would not have harmed a fly and hated to see even a mouse trap set, simply revelled in the newspaper accounts of murders, and the more shocking and cold-blooded they were, the more eagerly did Grandma read of them. This murder story was particularly good from Grandma's point of view. It was full of thrills. A man had been shot down apparently in cold blood, and his supposed murderer was still at large and had eluded all the efforts of justice to capture him. His name was Mark Hartwell, and he was described as a tall, fair man with full auburn beard and curly light hair. "What a shocking thing," said Grandma aloud. Her companion looked at her with kindly amused smile. "What is it?" he asked. "Why, this murderer at Charlotteville," answered Grandma, forgetting in her excitement that it was not safe to talk to people you meet on the train. "It just makes my blood run cold to read about it, and to think that the man who did it is still around the country somewhere, plotting other murders. I haven't a doubt. What is the good of the police?" "They're dull fellows," agreed the dark man. "But I don't envy that man his conscience," said Grandma solemnly, and somewhat inconsistently, in view of her statement about the other murders that were being plotted. "What must a man feel like who has had the blood of a fellow creature on his hands? Depend upon it, his punishment has begun already, caught or not." "That is true," said the dark man quietly. "Such a good-looking man, too," said Grandma, looking wistfully at the murder's picture. "It doesn't seem possible that he can have killed anybody. But the paper says there isn't a doubt." "He is probably guilty," said the dark man, "but nothing is known of his provocation. The affair may not have been so cold-blooded as the accounts state. Those newspaper fellows never err on the side of undercolouring." "I really think," said Grandma slowly, "that I would like to see a murder, just one. Whenever I say anything like that, Adelaide is Samuel's wife, looks at me as if she thought there was something wrong about it, and perhaps there is, but I do all the same. When I was a little girl there was a man in our settlement who was suspected of poisoning his wife. He died very suddenly. I used to look at him with such interest, but it wasn't satisfactory because you could never be sure whether he was really guilty or not. I never could believe that he was, because he was such a nice man in some ways and so good and kind to children. I don't believe a man who was bad enough to poison his wife could have any good in him." "Perhaps not," agreed the dark man. He had absent-mindedly folded up Grandma's old copy of the Argus and put it in his pocket. Grandma did not like to ask him for it, although she would have liked to see if there were any more murder stories in it. Besides, just at that moment the conductor came around for tickets. Grandma looked in the basket for her handkerchief. It was not there. She looked on the floor and on the seat and under the seat. It was not there. She stood up and shook herself. Still no handkerchief. "Dear, oh dear!" exclaimed Grandma wildly. "I've lost my ticket. I always knew I would. I told Cyrus I would. Oh, where can it be?" The conductor scowled unsympathetically. The dark man got up and helped Grandma search, but no ticket was to be found. "You'll have to pay the money then, and something extra," said the conductor gruffly. "I can't. I haven't a cent of money," wailed Grandma. "I gave it all to Cyrus because I was afraid my pocket would be picked. Oh, what shall I do?" "Don't worry. I'll make it all right," said the dark man. He took out his pocketbook and handed the conductor a bill. That functionary grumblingly made the change and marched onward, while Grandma, pale with excitement and relief, sank back into her seat. "I can't tell you how much I am obliged to you, sir," she said tremulously. "I don't know what I should have done. Would he have put me off right here in the snow?" "I hardly think he would have gone to such lengths," said the dark man with a smile. "But he's a cranky, disobliging fellow enough. I know him of old, and you must not feel overly grateful to him. I am glad of the opportunity to help you. I had an old grandmother myself once," he added with a sigh. "You must give me your name and address." "Of course," said Grandma, "and my son Samuel Sheldon of Midverne will see that the money is returned to you. Well, this is a lesson to me. I'll never trust myself on train again. And all I wish is that I was safely off this one. This fuss has worked my nerves all up again." "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll see you safely off the train when we get to Green Village." "Will you, though? Will you now?" said Grandma eagerly. "I'll be real easy in my mind then," she added with a returning smile. "I feel as if I could trust you for anything, and I'm a real suspicious person, too." They had a long talk after that, or rather Grandma talked and the dark man listened and smiled. She told him all about William, George, and Delilah and their baby, and about Samuel and Adelaide and Cyrus and Louise, and the 3 cats and the parrot. He seemed to enjoy her accounts of them, too. When they reached Green Village station he gathered up Grandma's parcels and helped her tenderly off the train. "Anybody here to meet Mrs. Sheldon?" he asked of the trainmaster. The latter shook his head. "Don't think so. Haven't seen anybody here to meet anybody tonight." "Dear, oh dear," said poor Grandma. "This is just what I expected. They've never got Cyrus's telegram. Well, I might have known it. What shall I do?" "How far is it to your son's?" asked the dark man. "Only half a mile, just over the hill there. But I'll never get there alone this dark night." "Of course not. But I'll go with you. The road is good. We'll do finely." "But that train won't wait for you," gasped Grandma, half in protest. "It doesn't matter. The Starmont freight passes here in half an hour, and I'll go on her. Come along, Grandma." "Oh, but you're good," said Grandma. "Some woman is proud to have you for a son." The man did not answer. He had not answered any of the personal remarks Grandma had made to him in her conversation. They were not long in reaching William George Sheldon's house, for the village road was good and Grandma was smart on her feet. She was welcomed with eagerness and surprise. "To think that there was no one to meet you!" exclaimed William George. "But I never dreamed of you coming by train, knowing how you were set against it." "Telegram? No, I got no telegram. S'pose Cyrus forgot to send it. I'm most heartily obliged to you, sir, for looking after my mother so kindly." "It was a pleasure," said the dark man courteously. He had taken off his hat, and they saw a curious scar, shaped like a large red butterfly, high up on his forehead under his hair. "I am delighted to have been of any assistance to her." He would not wait for supper. The next train would be in, and he must not miss it. "There are people looking for me," he said with his curious smile. "They will be much disappointed if they do not find me." He had gone, and the whistle of the Starmont freight had blown before Grandma remembered that he had not given her his name and address. "Dear, oh dear, how are we ever going to send that money to him?" she exclaimed. "And he so nice and good-hearted." Grandma worried over this for a week in the intervals of looking after Delia. One day William George came in with a large city daily in his hands. He looked curiously at Grandma and then showed her the front page picture of a man, clean shaven, with an oddly shaped scar high up on his forehead. "Did you ever see that man, Mother?" he asked. "Of course I did," said Grandma excitedly. "Why, it's the man I met on the train. Who is he? What's his name? Now we'll know where to send." "That is Mark Hartwell, who shot Amos Gray at Charlottesville 3 weeks ago," said William George quietly. Grandma looked at him blankly for a moment. "It couldn't be," she gasped at last. "That man a murderer? I'll never believe it." "It's true enough, Mother. The whole story is here. He had shaved his beard and dyed his hair, and came near getting clear out of the country. They were on his trail the day he came down in the train with you and lost it because of his getting off to bring you here. His disguise was so perfect that there was little fear of his being recognized so long as he hid that scar. But it was seen in Montreal, and he was run to earth there. He has made a full confession." "I don't care," cried Grandma valiantly. "I'll never believe he was all bad. A man who would do what he did for a poor old woman like me when he was flying for his life, too. No, no, there was good in him even if he did kill that man, and I'm sure he must feel terrible over it." In this view Grandma persisted. She never would say or listen to a word against Mark Hartwell, and she had only pity for him whom everyone else condemned. With her own trembling hands she wrote him a letter to accompany the money Samuel sent before Hartwell was taken to the penitentiary for life. She thanked him again for his kindness to her and assured him that she knew he was sorry for what he had done and that she would pray for him every night of her life. Mark Hartwell had been hard and defiant enough, but the prison officials told that he cried like a child over Grandma Sheldon's little letter. "There's nobody all bad," says Grandma when she relates the story. "I used to believe a murderer must be, but I know better now. I think of that poor man often and often. He was so kind and gentle to me. He must have been a good boy once. I wrote him a letter every Christmas and I sent him tracts and papers. He's my own little charity, but I've never been on the cars since, and I never will be again. You never can tell what will happen to you or what sort of people you'll meet if you trust yourself on a train." End of The Man on the Train. Story 24 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922 by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Romance of Jedediah. Jedediah was not a name that savoured of romance. His last name was Crane, which is little better, and it would be no use to call this story Mattie Adams' Romance because Mattie Adams is not a romantic name either. But names have really nothing to do with romance. The most exciting and tragic affair I ever knew was between a man named Silas Putdamer and a woman named Keziah Cullen, which has nothing to do with this present story. Jedediah, to all outward seeming, did not appear to be any more romantic than his name. He looked distinctly commonplace as he rode comfortably along the winding country road that was dreaming in the haze and sunshine of a midsummer afternoon. He was perched on the seat of a bright red peddler's wagon, above and behind a dusty, ambling red pony of that peculiar gait and appearance pertaining to the ponies of country peddlers. A certain placid, unhasting leanness, as of a nag that has encountered troubles of his own and has lived them down by sheer patience and staying power. From the bright red wagon proceeded a certain metallic rumbling and clinking as it bowled along, and 2 or 3 nests of tin pans on its flat rope-encircled top flashed back the light so dazzlingly that Jedediah seemed the beaming sun of a little planetary system all his own. A new broom, sticking up aggressively at each of the 4 corners, gave the wagon a resemblance to a triumphal chariot. Jedediah himself had not been in the tin peddling business long enough to acquire the apologetic, out-of-elbow appearance which distinguishes a tin peddler from other kinds of peddlers. In fact, this was his maiden venture in this line. Hence, he still looked plump and self-respecting. He had a round red face under his plug hat, twinkling blue eyes, and a little pursed-up mouth, the shape of which was partly due to nature and partly to much whistling. Jedediah's pudgy body was clothed in a suit of large, light checks, and he wore a bright pink necktie and an amethyst pin. Will I still be believed when I assert that, in spite of all this, Jedediah was full of, and bubbling over with, romance? Romance cares not for appearances and apparently delights in contradictions. The homely, shambling man was passed unnoticed on the street, may have, tucked away in his past, a story more exciting and thrilling than anything you have ever read in fiction. So it was, in a measure, with Jedediah, poor, unknown to fame, afflicted with a double chin and bald spot, reduced to driving a tin wagon for a living. He yet had his romance, and he was still romantic. As Jedediah rode through Amberley, he looked about him with interest. He knew it well, although it was 15 years since he had seen it. He had been born and brought up in Amberley. He had left it at the age of 25 to make his fortune. But Amberley was Amberley still. Jedediah found it hard to believe that it or himself was 15 years older. "There's the Stanton place," he said. "Charlie has painted the house yellow. It used to be white. And Bob Hollowman has cut the trees down behind the blacksmith forge. Bob never had any poetry in his soul, no romance, as you might say. He was what you might call a plodder. You might call him that. Get up, my nag, get up. There's the old Harkness place. Seems to be spruced up considerable. Folks used to say, if you wanted to see how the world looked the morning after the flood, just go into George Harkness's barnyard on a rainy day. The pond and the old hills ain't changed any. Get up, my nag, get up. There's the Adams homestead. Do I really behold it again?" Jedediah thought the moment deliciously romantic. He revelled in it, and to match his exhilarated mood he touched the pony with his whip and went clinking and glittering down the hill under the poplars at a dashing rate. He had not intended to offer his wares in Amberley that day. He meant to break the ice in Occidental, the village beyond, but he could not pass the Adams place. When he came to the open gate he turned in under the willows and drove down the wide, shady lane, girt on both sides with the trim white paling, smothered in lavish sweetbriar bushes that were gay with bloom. Jedediah's heart was beating furiously under his chest. "What a fool you are, Jed Crane," he told himself. "You used to be a young fool, and now you're an old one. Sad, that. Get up, my nag, get up. It's a poor lookout for a man of your years, Jed. Don't get excited. It ain't the least likely that Mattie Adams is here yet. She's married and gone years ago, no doubt. It's probable there's no Adamses here at all now. But it's romantic. Yes, it's romantic. It's splendid. Get up, my nag, get up." The Adams place itself was not unromantic. The house was a large, old-fashioned white one with green shutters and a front porch with Grecian columns. These were thought very elegant in Amberley. Mrs. Carmody said they gave a house such a classical air. In this instance the classical effect was somewhat smothered in honeysuckle, which rioted over the whole porch and hung in pale yellow fragrant festoons over the rows of potted scarlet geraniums that flanked the green steps. Beyond the house a low-boughed orchard covered the slope between it and the main road, and behind it there was a revel of colour betokening a flower garden. Jedediah climbed down from his lofty seat and walked dubiously to a side door that looked more friendly, despite its prim screen, than the classical front porch. As he drew near he saw a woman sitting behind the screen, a woman who rose as he approached and opened the door. Jedediah's heart had been beating a wild tattoo as he crossed the yard. It now stopped altogether. At least, he declared in later years, it did. The woman was Mattie Adams. Mattie Adams, 15 years older than when he had seen her last. Plumper, rosier, somewhat broader face, but still unmistakably Mattie Adams. Jedediah felt that the situation was delicious. "Mattie," he said, holding out his hand. "Why, Jed, how are you?" said Mattie, as if they had parted the week before. It had always taken a great deal to disturb Mattie. Whatever happened, she was calm. Even an old lover, and the only one she had ever possessed at that, dropping, so to speak, from the skies after 15 years' disappearance, did not ruffle her placidity. "I didn't suppose you'd know me, Mattie," said Jedediah, still holding her hand foolishly. "I knew you the minute I set eyes on you," returned Mattie. "You're some fatter and older, like myself, but you're Jed still. Where have you been all these years?" "Pretty near everywhere, Mattie, pretty near everywhere. And you see what it's come to. Here I be driving a tin wagon from Boone Brothers. Business is business. Don't you want to buy some new tinware?" To himself, Jed thought it was romantic, asking a woman who he had loved all his life to buy tins on the occasion of their first meeting after 15 years' separation. "I don't know, but I do want a quart measure," said Mattie, in her sweet, unchanged voice. but all in good time. You must stay and have tea with me, Jed. I'm all alone now. Mother and Father have gone. Unhitch your horse and put him in the third stall in the stable." Jed hesitated. "I ought to be getting on, I s'pose," he said wistfully. "I ain't done much today." "You must stay to tea," interrupted Mattie. "Why, Jed, there's ever so much to tell and ask, and we can't stand here in the yard and talk. Look at Selena. There she is, watching us from the kitchen window. She'll watch as long as we stand here." Jed swung himself around. Over the little valley below the Adams homestead was a steep, treeless hill, and on its crest was perched a bare farmhouse with windows stuck lavishly all over it. At one of them a long, pale face was visible. "Has Selena been pasted up at that window ever since the last time we stood here and talked, Mattie?" asked Jed, half resentfully, half amusedly. It was characteristic of Mattie to laugh first at the question and then blush over the memory it revived. "Most of the time, I guess," she said shortly. "But come in. I never could talk under Selena's eye, even if they were 400 yards away." Jed went in and stayed to tea. The old Adams pantry had not failed, nor apparently the Adams skill in cooking. After tea Jed hung around till sunset and drove away with a warm invitation from Mattie to call every time his rounds took him through Amberley. As he went, Selena's face appeared at the window of the house over the valley. When he had gone, Mattie went around to the classical porch and sat herself down under the honeysuckle festoons that dangled above her smooth braid of fawn-coloured hair. She knew Selena would be down post haste presently, agog with curiosity to find out who the peddler was whom Mattie had delighted to honour with an invitation to tea. Mattie preferred to meet Selena out of doors. It was easier to thrust and parry there. Meanwhile, she wanted to think over things. 15 years before, Jedediah Crane had been Mattie Adams' beau. Jedediah was romantic even then, but as he was a slim young fellow at the time, with an abundance of fair curly hair and innocent blue eyes, his romance was rather an attraction than not. At least, the then young and pretty Mattie had found it so. The Adamses looked with no favour on the match. They were a thrifty, well-to-do folks. As for the Cranes, well, they were lazy and shiftless for the most part. It would be a mésalliance for an Adams to marry a Crane. Still, it would doubtless have happened, for Mattie thought a meek-looking damsel had a mind of her own, had it not been for Selena Ford, Mattie's older sister. Selena, people said, had married James Ford for no other reason than that his house commanded a view of nearly every dooryard in Amberley. This may or may not have been sheer malice. Certainly nothing that went on in the Adams yard escaped Selena. She watched Mattie and Jed in the moonlight one night. She saw Jed kiss Mattie. It was the first time he had ever done so, and the last, poor fellow. For Selena swooped down on her parents the next day. Such a storm did she brew up that Mattie was forbidden to speak to Jed again. Selena herself gave Jed a piece of her mind. Jed usually was not afflicted with undue sensitiveness, but he had some slumbering pride at the basis of his character, and it was very stubborn when roused. Selena roused it. Jed vowed he would never creep and crawl at the feet of the Adamses, and he went west forthwith, determined, as aforesaid, to make his fortune and hurl Selena's scorn back in her face. And now he had come home, driving a tin wagon. Mattie smiled to think of it. She bore Jed no ill will for his failure. She felt sorry for him and inclined to think that fate had used him hardly, fate and Selena together. Mattie had never had another beau. People thought she was engaged to Jed Crane until her time for beaus went by. Mattie did not mind. She had never liked anybody so well as Jed. To be sure, she had not thought of him for years. It was strange he should come back like this, romantic, as he said himself. Mattie's reverie was interrupted by Selena. Angular, pale-eyed Mrs. Ford was as unlike the plump, rosy Mattie as a sister could be. Perhaps her chronic curiosity, which would not let her rest, was accountable for her excessive leanness. "Who was that peddler that was here this afternoon, Mattie?" she demanded as soon as she arrived. Mattie smiled. "Jed Crane," she said. "He's home from the west and driving a tin wagon for the Boones." Selena gave a little gasp. She sat down on the lowest step and untied her bonnet strings. "Mattie Adams, and you kept him hanging about the whole afternoon?" "Why not?" said Mattie wickedly. She liked to alarm Selena. "Jed and I were always beaux, you know." "Mattie Adams, you don't mean to say you're going to make a fool of yourself over Jed Crane again, a woman of your age?" "Don't get excited, Selena," implored Mattie. In the old days Selena could cow her, but that time was past. "I never saw the like of you for getting stirred up over nothing." "I'm not excited. I'm perfectly calm. But I might well be excited over your folly, Mattie Adams. The idea of your taking up again with old Jed Crane." "He's 15 years younger than Jim," said Mattie, giving thrust for thrust. When Selena had come over, Mattie had not the slightest idea of resuming her former relationship with the romantic Jedediah. She had merely shown her kindness for old friendship's sake. But so well did the unconscious Selena work it in Jed's behalf that when she flounced off home in a pet, Mattie was resolved that she would take Jed back if he wanted to come. She wasn't going to put up with Selena's everlasting interference. She would show her that she was independent. When a week had passed, Jed came again. He sold Mattie a stewpan, and he would not go in to tea this time. But they stood and talked in the yard for the best part of an hour, while Selena glared at them from her kitchen window. Their conversation was most innocent and harmless, being mainly gossip about what had come and gone during Jed's exile. But Mattie knew that Selena thought that she and Jed were making love to each other in this shameless public fashion. When Jed went, Mattie, more for Selena's benefit than his, broke off some sprays of honeysuckle and pinned them on his coat. The fragrance went with Jedediah as he drove through Amberley, and pleasant thoughts were born of it. "It's romantic," he told the pony. "Blessed if it ain't romantic. Not that Mattie cares anything about me now. I know she don't. But it's just her kind way. She wants to cheer me up and let me know I've a friend still. Get up, my Ned, get up. I ain't one to presume on her kindness neither. I know my place. But still, say what you will, it's romantic. This situation. This is it. Here I be, loving the ground she walks on, as I've always done. And I can't let on that I do because I'm a poor ne'er-do-well and I ain't fit to look at her. An independent woman with property. And she's a showing kindness to me for old time's sake. And piercing my heart all the time, not knowing. Why, it's romance with a vengeance. That's what it is. Get up, my Ned, get up." Thereafter Jed called at the Adams place every week. Generally he stayed to tea. Mattie always bought something of him to colour an excuse. Her kitchen fairly glittered with new tinware. She gave Selena the overflow by way of heaping coals of fire. After every visit Jedediah held stern counsel with himself and decided that he must not call to see Mattie again, at least not for a long time. Then he must not stay to tea. He would struggle with himself all the way down the poplar hill, not without comforting sense of the romance of the struggle. But it always ended the same way. He turned in under the willows and clinked musically into Mattie's yard. At least the rattle of the tin wagon sounded musically to Mattie. Meanwhile Selena watched from her window and raged. Amberley people shrugged their shoulders when gossip noised the matter abroad, but being good-humoured in the main, they forbore to do more than say that Mattie Adams was free to make a goose of herself if it pleased her, and that Jed Crane wasn't much a fool as he looked. The Adams farm was one of the best in Amberley, and it had not grown any poorer under Mattie's management. If Jed walks in there and hangs up his hat, he'll have done well for himself after all. This was Selena's view of it also, bearing the good nature. She was furious at the whole affair, and she did her best to make Mattie's life a burden to her with slurs and thrusts. But they all misjudged Jed. He had no intention of walking in and hanging up his hat, or trying to. Romantic as he was, it never occurred to him that Mattie might be as romantic as himself. She did not care for him, and anyhow he, Jed, had a little too much pride to ask her, a rich woman, to marry him, a poor man who had lost all caste he ever possessed by taking up tin peddling. Jed was determined not to presume, and oh, how deliciously romantic it all was. He hugged himself with sorrowful delight over it. As the summer waned and the long yellow leaves began to fall thickly from the willows in the Adams Lane, Jed began to talk of going out west again. Tin peddling was not possible in winter, and he didn't think he would try it another summer. Mattie listened with dismay in her heart. All summer she had made much of Jed by way of tormenting Selena, but now she realized what he really meant to her. The old love had wakened to life in her heart. She could not let Jed go out of her life again, leaving her to the old loneliness. If Jed went away, everything would be flat, stale, and unprofitable. She knew him to be at heart the kindest, most gentle of human beings, and the mere fact of his having been unsuccessful, even what some of his old neighbours might call stupid, did not change her feelings toward him in the least. He was Jed. That was sufficient for her, and she had business capability enough for both. When it came to that, Mattie began to drop hints, but Jed would not take them. True, once or twice he thought that perhaps Mattie did care a little for him yet, but it would not do for him to take advantage of that. "No, I just couldn't do that," he told the pony. "I worship the ground that woman treads on, but it ain't for the likes of me to tell her so. Not now. Get up, my nag, get up. This has been a mighty pleasant summer with that visit to look forward to every week, but it's about over now and you must tramp, Jed." Jed sighed. He remembered that it was more romantic than ever, but all at once this failed to comfort him. Romance, up to a certain point, was food. Beyond that it paled, so to speak. Jed's romance failed him just when he needed it most. Mattie, meanwhile, was forced to the dismal conclusion that her hints were thrown away. Jed was plainly determined not to speak. Mattie felt half angry with him. She did not choose to make a martyr of herself to romance, and surely the man didn't expect her to ask him to marry her. "I'm sure and certain he's as fond of me as ever he was," she mused. "I suppose he's got some ridiculous notion about being too poor to aspire to me. Jed always had more pride than a crane could carry. Well, I've done all I can, all I'm going to do. If Jed's determined to go, he must go, I suppose." Mattie would not let herself cry, although she felt like it. She went out and picked apples instead. Mattie might have remained so, and Jedediah's romance might never have reached a better ending if it had not been for Selena, who came over just then to help Mattie pick the golden russets. Fate had evidently destined her as Jed's best helper. All summer she had been fairly goading Mattie into love with Jedediah, and now she was moved to add the last spur. "Jed Crane's going away, I hear," she said maliciously. "Seems to me you're bound to be jilted again, Mattie." Mattie had no answer ready. Selena went on undauntedly. "You've made a nice fool of yourself all summer, I vow, throwing yourself at Jed's head, and he doesn't want you, even with all your property." "He does want me," said Mattie calmly. Her lips were very firm and her cheeks scarlet. "He is not going away. We are to be married about Christmas, and Jed will take charge of the farm for me." "Matilda Adams," said Selena. It was all she was capable of saying. The rest of the golden russets were picked in a dead silence, Mattie working with an unusually high colour in her cheeks, while Selena's thin lips were pressed so closely together as to be little else than a hairline. After Selena had gone home, sulking, Mattie picked on with a very determined face. The die was cast. She could not bear Selena's slurs, and she would not. And she had not told a lie either. Her words were true. She would make them true. All the Adams' determination, and that was not a little, was roused in her. "If Jed jilts me, he'll do it to my face, clean and clever," she said viciously. When Jed came again, he was very solemn. He thought it would be his last visit, but Mattie felt differently. She had dressed herself with unusual care and crimped her hair. Her cheeks were scarlet and her eyes bright. Jed thought she looked younger and prettier than ever. The thought that this was the last time he would see her for many a long day to come grew more and more unbearable. Yet he firmly determined he would let no presuming word pass his lips. Mattie had been so kind to him. It was only honourable of him in return not to let her throw herself away on a poor failure like himself. "I suppose this is your last round with the wagon," she said. She had taken him out into the garden to say it. The garden was out of view from the Ford place. Propose she must, but she drew the line at proposing under Selena's eyes. Jed nodded dully. "Yes, and then I must toddle off and look for something else to do. You see, I haven't much of a gift, so to speak, for business, Mattie, and it takes me so long to get worked into an understanding of a business or trade that I'm generally asked to quit before you might say I've really commenced. It's been a mighty happy summer for me, though. I can't say I've done much in the selling line except to you, Mattie. What with your kindness and these little visits you've been good enough to let me make every week, I feel I may say it's been the happiest summer of my life, and I'm never going to forget it. But as I said, it's time for me to be moving on elsewhere and finding something else to do. There is something for you to do right here, if you'll do it, said Mattie faintly. For a moment she felt as if she could not go on. Jed in the garden and the scarf of late asters whirled around her dizzily. She held by the sweet pea trellis to steady herself. I said a terrible thing to Selena the other day. I don't know what I'll do about it if you don't help me out, Jed." "I'll do anything I can," said Jed with hearty sympathy. "You know that, Mattie. What's the trouble?" His kindly voice and the good will and affection beaming in his honest blue eyes gave Mattie renewed courage to go on with her self-imposed and most embarrassing task, although before she ended her voice shook and dwindled away to such a low whisper that Jed had to bend his head close to hers to hear what she was saying. I said she goaded me into saying it, Jed, slighting and slurring, jeering at me because you were going away. I just got mad, Jed, and I told her you weren't going, that you and I, that we were to be married." "Mattie, did you mean that?" he cried. "If you did, I'm the happiest man alive. I didn't dare presume. I didn't suppose you thought anything of me. But if you do, and if you want me, here's all there is of me, heart and soul and body, forever and ever, as I've been all my life." Thinking over this speech afterwards, Jed was dissatisfied with it. He thought he might have made it much more eloquent and romantic than it was, but it served the purpose very well. It was convincing. It came straight from his honest, stupid heart, and Mattie knew it. She held out her hands, and Jed gathered her into his arms. It was certainly a most fortunate circumstance that the garden was well out of the range of Selena's vision, or the sight of her sister and the remaining member of the despised Crane family repeating their foolish performance, which many years previous had resulted in Jed's long banishment, might have caused her to commit almost any unheard of act of spite as an outlet for her jealous anger. But only the few remaining garden flowers were witness to the lovers' indiscretion, and they kept their own counsel after the manner of flowers. So Selena's feelings were mercifully spared this further outrage. That evening Jed drove slowly away through the twilight, mounted for the last time on the tin wagon. He was so happy that he bore no grudge against even Selena Ford. As the pony climbed the poplar hill, Jed drew a long breath and freed his mind to the surrounding landscape and to his faithful and slow-plodding steed that had been one of the main factors in this love affair, having patiently carried him to and from the abode of his lady love throughout the summer just past. Jedediah was as brimful of happiness as mortal man could be, and his rosy thoughts flowed forth in a kind of triumphant chant which would have driven Selena stark distracted had she been within hearing distance. What he said, too, was but a poor expression of what he thought, but to the trees and fields and pony he chanted, "Well, this is romance. What else would you call it now? Me, poor, scared to speak, and Mattie ups and does it for me. Bless her! Yes, I've been longing for romance all my life, and I've got it at last. None of your commonplace courtships for me. I always said them was my very words, and I guess this has been a little uncommon. I guess it has. Anyhow, I'm uncommon happy. I never felt so romantic before. Get up, my nag, get up." End of The Romance of Jedediah. Story 25 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. The Tryst of the White Lady. "I wish you'd get married, Roger," said Catherine Ames. "I'm getting too old to work. 70 last April, and who's going to look after ye when I'm gone? Get married, bye, get married." Roger Temple winced. His aunt's harsh, disagreeable voice always jarred him horribly on his sensitive nerves. He was fond of her after fashion, but always that voice made him wonder if there could be anything harder to endure. Then he gave a bitter little laugh. "Who'd have me, Aunt Catherine?" he asked. Catherine Ames looked at him critically across the supper table. She loved him in her way, with all her heart, but she was not in the least blind to his defects. She did not mince matters with herself or with other people. Roger was a sallow, plain-featured fellow, small and insignificant looking, and as if this were not bad enough, he walked with a slight limp and had one thin shoulder a little higher than the other. Jarback Temple he had been called in school, and the name still clung to him. To be sure, he had very fine grey eyes, but their dreamy brilliance gave his dull face an uncanny look which girls did not like, and so made matters rather worse than better. Of course, looks didn't matter so much in the case of a man. Steve Millar was homely enough and all marked up with smallpox to boot, yet he had got for a wife the prettiest and smartest girl in South Bay. But Steve was rich, Roger was poor, and always would be. He worked his stony little farm from which his father and grandfather had wrested a fair living, after a fashion, but nature had not cut him out for a successful farmer. He hadn't the strength for it, and his heart wasn't in it. He'd rather be hanging over a book. Catherine secretly thought Roger's matrimonial chances very poor, but it would not do to discourage the bye. What he needed was spurring on. "You'll get someone if you don't fly too high," she announced loudly and cheerfully. "There's always a gal or two here and thar that's glad to marry for a home. 'Tain't no use for you to be setting your thoughts on anyone young and pretty. You wouldn't get her, and you'd be worse off if you did. Your grandfather married for looks, and a nice, useless wife he got. Sick half her time. Get a good, strong girl that ain't afraid of work. That'll hold things together when ye are reading poetry. That's as much as you can expect, and the sooner the better. I'm done. Last winter's rheumatiz has about finished me, and we can't afford hired help." Roger felt as if his raw, quivering soul were being seared. He looked at his aunt curiously, at her broad, flat face with the mole on the end of her dumpy nose, the bristling hairs on her chin, the wrinkled yellow neck, the pale, protruding eyes, the coarse, good-humoured mouth. She was so extremely ugly, and he had seen her across the table all his life. For 25 years he had looked at her so. Must he continue to go on looking at ugliness in the shape of a wife all the rest of his life, he who worshipped beauty in everything? "Did my mother look like you, Aunt Catherine?" he asked abruptly. His aunt stared and snorted. Her snort was meant to express kindly amusement, but it sounded like derision and contempt. "Your ma wasn't no homely as me," she said cheerfully, "but she wa'n't no beauty either. None of the Temples was ever better looking than was necessary. We was workers. Your pa wa'n't bad looking. You're homelier than either of 'em. Some ways you take after your grandma, though she was counted pretty at one time. She was yaller and spindlin' like you, and you've got her eyes. What you're so interested in your ma's looks all at once fer?" "I was wondering," said Roger coolly, "if Father ever looked at her across the table and wished she were prettier." Catherine giggled. Her giggle was ugly and disagreeable like everything else about her, everything except a certain odd, loving, loyal old heart buried deep in her bosom, for the sake of which Roger endured the giggle and all the rest. "Dessay he did, dessay he did. Men allays has a hankerin' for good looks, but ye've got to cut your coat 'cording to your cloth. As for your poor ma, she didn't live long enough to get as ugly as me. When I come here to keep house for your pa, folks said as it wouldn't be long for he married me. I wouldn't 'a' minded, but your pa never hinted it. Suppose he'd had enough ugly women likely." Catherine snorted amiably again. Roger got up. He couldn't endure any more just then. He must escape. "Now you think over what I've said," his aunt called after him. "Ye've gotter get a wife soon, however you manage it. 'Twon't be so hard if you're reasonable. Don't stay out as late as yer did last night. Ye coughed all night. Where was ye? Down at the shore?" "No," said Roger, who always answered her questions even when he hated to. "I was down at Aunt Isabel's grave." "Till 11 o'clock? Ye ain't wise. I don't know what hankering ye have after that unchancy place. I ain't been near it for 20 years. I wonder ye ain't scairt. What'd ye think ye'd do if ye saw her ghost?" Catherine looked curiously at Roger. She was very superstitious, and she believed firmly in ghosts, and saw no absurdity in her question. "I wish I could see it," said Roger, his great eyes flashing. He believed in ghosts, too, at least in Isabel Temple's ghost. His uncle had seen it. His grandfather had seen it. He believed he would see it, the beautiful, bewitching, mocking, luring ghost of lovely Isabel Temple. "Don't wish such stuff," said Catherine. "Nobody ain't never the same after they've seen her." Was Uncle different? Roger had come back into the kitchen and was looking curiously at his aunt. Different? He was another man. He didn't even look the same. Sich eyes, always looking past ye at something behind ye. They'd give anyone creeps. He never had any notion of flesh and blood women after that. Said a man wouldn't after seeing Isabel. His life was plumb ruined. Lucky he died young. I hated to be in the same room with him. He wa'n't canny. That was all there was to it. You keep away from that grave. You don't want to look odder than ye are by nature, and when ye get married you'll have to give up roaming about half the night in graveyards. A wife wouldn't put up with it, as I've done." "I'll never get as good a wife as you, Aunt Catherine," said Roger with a little whimsical smile that gave him the look of an amused gnome. "Dessay you won't, but someone ye have to have. Why'n't ye try 'Liza Adams? She might have ye. She's getting on." "'Liza Adams?" "That's what I said. You don't repeat it. 'Liza Adamses. If I'd mentioned a hippopotamus, I get out of patience with ye. I believe in my heart ye think ye ought to get a wife that'd look like a picture." "I do, Aunt Catherine. That's just the kind of wife I want. Grace and beauty and charm. Nothing less than that will ever content me." Roger laughed bitterly again and went out. It was sunset. There was no work to do that night except to milk the cows, and his little home boy could do that. He felt a glad freedom. He put his hand in his pocket to see if his beloved Wordsworth was there, and then he took his way across the fields, under a sky of purple and amber, walking quickly despite his limp. He wanted to get to some solitary place where he could forget Aunt Catherine and her abominable suggestions, and escape into the world of dreams where he habitually lived, and where he found the loveliness he had not found nor could hope to find in his real world. Roger's mother had died when he was 3, and his father when he was 8. His little old bedridden grandmother had lived until he was 12. He had loved her passionately. She had not been pretty in his remembrance, a tiny, shrunken, wrinkled thing, but she had beautiful gray eyes that never grew old, and a soft, gentle voice, the only woman's voice he had ever heard with pleasure. He was very critical as regards women's voices, and very sensitive to them. Nothing hurt him quite so much as an unlovely voice, not even unloveliness of face. Her death had left him desolate. She was the only human being who had ever understood him. He could never, he thought, have got through his tortured school days without her. After she died, he would not go to school. He was not in any sense educated. His father and grandfather had been illiterate men, and he had inherited their underdeveloped brain cells. But he loved poetry and read all he could get of it. It overlaid his primitive nature with a curious iridescence of fancy and furnished him with ideals and hungers his environment could never satisfy. He loved beauty in everything. Moonrises hurt him with their loveliness, and he could sit for hours gazing at a white narcissus, much to his aunt's exasperation. He was solitary by nature. He felt horribly alone in a crowded building, but never in the woods or in the wild places along the shore. It was because of this that his aunt could not get him to go to church, which was a horror to her orthodox soul. He told her he would like to go to church if it were empty, but he could not bear it when it was full of smug, ugly people. Most people, he thought, were ugly, though not so ugly as he was, and ugliness made him sick with repulsion. Now and then he saw a pretty girl at whom he liked to look, but he never saw one that wholly pleased him. To him, the homely, crippled, poverty-stricken Roger Temple, whom they all would have scorned, there was always a certain subtle something wanting, and the lack of it kept him heart-whole. He knew that this probably saved him from much suffering, but for all that he regretted it. He wanted to love, even vainly. He wanted to experience this passion of which the poets sang so much. Without it, he felt he lacked the key to a world of wonder. He even tried to fall in love. He went to church for several Sundays and sat where he could see beautiful Elsa Carey. She was lovely. It gave him pleasure to look at her. The gold of her hair was so bright and living. the pink of her cheek so pure, the curve of her neck so flawless, the lashes of her eyes so dark and silken. But he looked at her as at a picture. When he tried to think and dream of her, it bored him. Besides, he knew she had a rather nasal voice. He used to laugh sarcastically to himself over Elsa's feelings if she had known how desperately he was trying to fall in love with her and failing. Elsa, the Queen of Hearts, who believed she had only to look to reign. He gave up trying at last, but he still longed to love. He knew he could never marry. He could not marry plainness, and beauty would have none of him. But he did not want to miss everything, and he had moments when he was very bitter and rebellious because he felt he must miss it forever. He went straight to Isabel Temple's grave in the remote shore field of his farm. Isabel Temple had lived and died 80 years ago. She had been very lovely, very willful, very fond of playing with the hearts of men. She had married William Temple, the brother of his great-grandfather, and as she stood in her white dress beside her bridegroom at the conclusion of the wedding ceremony, a jilted lover, crazed by despair, had entered the house and shot her dead. She had been buried in the shore field, where a square space had been diked off in the centre for a burial lot because the church was then so far away. With the passage of years the lot had grown up so thickly with fir and birch and wild cherry that it looked like a compact grove. A winding path led through it to its heart where Isabel Temple's grave was, thickly overgrown with long, silken, pale green grass. Roger hurried along the path and sat down on the big grey boulder by the grave, looking about him with a long breath of delight. How lovely and witching and unearthly it was here. Little ferns were growing in the hollows and cracks of the big boulder where clay had lodged. Over Isabel Temple's crooked lichen gravestone hung a young wild cherry in its delicate bloom. Above it, in a little space of sky left by the slender tree tops, was a young moon. It was too dark here after all to read Wordsworth, but that did not matter. The place, with its moist air, its tang of fir balsam, was like a perfumed room where a man might dream dreams and see visions. There was a soft murmur of wind in the boughs over him, and the faraway moan of the sea on the bar crept in. Roger surrendered himself utterly to the charm of the place. When he entered that grove, he had left behind the realm of daylight and things known, and come into the realm of shadow and mystery and enchantment. Anything might happen. Anything might be true. 80 long years had come and gone, but Isabel Temple, thus cruelly torn from life at the moment when it had promised her most, did not even yet rest calmly in her grave. Such at least was the story, and Roger believed it. It was in his blood to believe it. The Temples were a superstitious family, and there was nothing in Roger's upbringing to correct the tendency. His was not a skeptical or scientific mind. He was ignorant and poetical and credulous. He had always accepted unquestioningly the tale that Isabel Temple had been seen on earth long after the red clay was heaped over her murdered body. Her bridegroom had seen her when he went to visit her on the eve of his second and unhappy marriage. His grandfather had seen her. His grandmother, who had told him Isabel's story, had told him this too, and believed it. She had added with a bitterness foreign to his idea of her that her husband had never been the same to her afterwards. His uncle had seen her and had lived and died a haunted man. It was only to men the lovely, restless ghost appeared, and her appearance boded no good to him who saw. Roger knew this, but he had a curious longing to see her. He had never avoided her grave as others of his tribe did. He loved the spot, and he believed that some time he would see Isabel Temple there. She came, so the story went, to one in each generation of the family. He gazed down at her sunken grave. A little wind that came stealing along the floor of the grove raised and swayed the long hair like grass on it, giving the curious suggestion of something prisoned under it trying to draw a long breath and float upward. Then, when he lifted his eyes again, he saw her. She was standing behind the gravestone under the cherry tree, whose long white branches touched her head, standing there with her head drooping a little, but looking steadily at him. It was just between dusk and dark now, but he saw her very plainly. She was dressed in white with some filmy scarf over her head, and her hair hung in a dark, heavy braid over her shoulder. Her face was small and ivory white, and her eyes were very large and dark. Roger looked straight into them, and they did something to him, drew something out of him that was never to be his again. His heart. his soul. He did not know. He only knew that lovely Isabel Temple had now come to him and that he was hers forever. For a few moments that seemed years he looked at her, looked till the lure of her eyes drew him to his feet as a man rises in sleepwalking. As he slowly stood up, the low hanging boughs of a fir tree pushed his cap down over his face and blinded him. When he snatched it off, she was gone. Roger Temple did not go home that night till the spring dawn was in the sky. Catherine was sleepless with anxiety about him. When she heard him come up the stairs, she opened her door and peeped out. Roger went along the hall without seeing her. His brilliant eyes stared straight before him, and there was something in his face that made Catherine steal back to her bed with a little shiver of fear. He looked like his uncle. She did not ask him when they met at breakfast where or how he had spent the night. He had been dreading the question and was relieved beyond measure when it was not asked. But, apart from that, he was hardly conscious of her presence. He ate and drank mechanically and voicelessly. When he had gone out, Catherine wagged her uncomely grey head ominously. "He's bewitched," she muttered. "I know the signs. He's seen her. Drat her! It's time she gave up that kind of work. Well, I don't know what to do. There ain't anything I can do, I reckon. He'll never marry now. I'm as sure of that as of any mortal thing. He's in love with a ghost." It had not yet occurred to Roger that he was in love. He thought of nothing but Isabel Temple, her lovely, lovely face, sweeter than any picture he had ever seen or any ideal he had dreamed, her long dark hair, her slim form, and more than all, her compelling eyes. He saw them wherever he looked. They drew him. He would have followed them to the end of the world, heedless of all else. He longed for night, that he might again steal to the grave in the haunted grove. She might come again. Who knew? He felt no fear, nothing but a terrible hunger to see her again. But she did not come that night, nor the next, nor the next. 2 weeks went by, and he had not seen her. Perhaps he would never see her again. The thought filled him with anguish not to be borne. He knew now that he loved her. Isabel Temple, dead for 80 years. This was love, this searing, torturing, intolerably sweet thing, this possession of body and soul and spirit. The poets had sung but weakly of it. He could tell them better if he could find words. Could other men have loved at all? Could any men love those blowsy, common girls of earth? It seemed impossible, absurd. There was only one thing that could be loved, that white spirit. No wonder his uncle had died. He, Roger Temple, would soon die too. That would be well. Only the dead could woo Isabel. Meanwhile, he revelled in his torment and his happiness, so madly commingled that he never knew whether he was in heaven or hell. It was beautiful and dreadful and wonderful and exquisite. Oh, so exquisite! Mortal love could never be so exquisite. He had never lived before. Now he lived in every fibre of his being. He was glad Aunt Catherine did not worry him with questions. He had feared she would, but she never asked any questions now, and she was afraid of Roger, as she had been afraid of his uncle. She dared not ask questions. It was a thing that must not be tampered with. Who knew what she might hear if she asked him questions? She was very unhappy. Something dreadful had happened to her poor boy. He had been bewitched by that hussy. He would die as his uncle had died. "Maybe it's best," she muttered. "He's the last of the Temples, so maybe she'll rest in her grave when she's killed 'em all. I dunno what she's such a spite at them for. There'd be more sense if she'd haunt the Mortons, seeing as a Morton killed her. Well, I'm mighty old and tired and worn out. It won't seem that it's been much use, the way I've slaved and fussed to bring that boy up and keep things together for him. And now the ghost's got him. I might as well have let him die when he was a sickly baby." If this had been said to Roger, he would have retorted that it was worth while to have lived long enough to feel what he was feeling now. He would not have missed it for a score of other men's lives. He had drunk of some immortal wine and was as a god. Even if she never came again, he had seen her once, and she had taught him life's great secret in that one unforgettable exchange of eyes. She was his in spite of his ugliness and his crooked shoulder. No man could ever take her from him. But she did come again. One evening, when the darkening grove was full of magic in the light of the rising yellow moon shining across the level field, Roger sat on the big boulder by the grave. The evening was very still. There was no sound save the echoes of noisy laughter that seemed to come up from the bay shore. Drunken fishermen, likely as not. Roger resented the intrusion of such a sound in such a place. It was a sacrilege. When he came here to dream of her, only the loveliest of muted sounds should be heard, the faintest whisper of trees, the half-heard, half-felt moan of surf, the airiest sigh of wind. He never read Wordsworth now, or any other book. He only sat there and thought of her, his great eyes alight, his pale face flushed with the wonder of his love. She slipped through the dark boughs like a moonbeam and stood by the stone. Again he saw her quite plainly, saw and drank her in with his eyes. He did not feel surprise. Something in him had known she would come again. He would not move a muscle lest he lose her as he had lost her before. They looked at each other for how long? He did not know, and then a horrible thing happened. Into that place of wonder and revelation and mystery reeled a hiccuping, laughing creature, a drunken sailor from a harbour ship with a leering face and desecrating breath. "Oh, you're here, my dear. I thought I'd catch you yet," he said. He caught hold of her. She screamed. Roger sprang forward and struck him in the face. In his fury of sudden rage the strength of 10 seemed to animate his slender body and pass into his blow. The sailor reeled back and put up his hands. He was a coward, and even a brave man might have been daunted by that terrible white face and those blazing eyes. He backed down the path. "Shorry, shorry," he muttered. "Didn't know she was your girl. Shorry I butted in. Shentlemans never butt in. Shorry, sure, shorry." He kept repeating his ridiculous "shorry" until he was out of the grove. Then he turned and ran stumblingly across the field. Roger did not follow. He went back to Isabel Temple's grave. The girl was lying across it. He thought she was unconscious. He stooped and picked her up. She was light and small, but she was warm flesh and blood. She clung uncertainly to him for a moment, and he felt her breath on his face. He did not speak. He was too sick at heart. She did not speak either. He did not think this strange until afterwards. He was incapable of thinking just then. He was dazed, wretched, lost. Presently he became aware that she was timidly pulling his arm. It seemed that she wanted him to go with her. She was evidently frightened of that brute. He must take her to safety. And then she moved on down the little path, and he followed. Out in the moonlit field he saw her clearly. With her drooping head, her flowing dark hair, her great brown eyes, she looked like the nymph of a woodbrook, a haunter of shadows, a creature sprung from the wild. But she was mortal made, and he, what a fool he had been! Presently he would laugh at himself when this dazed agony should clear away from his brain. He followed her down the long field to the bay shore. Now and then she paused and looked back to see if he were coming, but she never spoke. When she reached the shore road she turned and went along it until they came to an old grey house fronting the calm grey harbour. At its gate she paused. Roger knew now who she was. Catherine had told him about her a month ago. She was Lilith Barr, a girl of 18 who had come to live with her uncle and aunt. Her father had died some months before. She was absolutely deaf as a result of some accident in childhood, and she was, as his own eyes told him, exquisitely lovely in her white, haunting style. But she was not Isabel Temple. He had tricked himself. He had lived in a fool's paradise. Oh, he must get away and laugh at himself. He left her at her gate, disregarding the little hand she put timidly out. But he did not laugh at himself. He went back to Isabel Temple's grave and flung himself down on it and cried like a boy. He wept his stormy, anguished soul out on it, and when he rose and went away, he believed it was forever. He thought he could never, never go there again. Catherine looked at him curiously the next morning. He looked wretched, haggard and hollow-eyed. She knew he had not come in till the summer dawn, but he had lost the rapt, uncanny look she hated. Suddenly she no longer felt afraid of him. With this she began to ask questions again. "What kept you out so late again last night, boy?" she asked reproachfully. Roger looked at her in her mourning ugliness. He had not really seen her for weeks. Now she smote on his tortured senses, so long drugged with beauty, like a physical blow. He suddenly burst into a laughter that frightened her. "Preserves, boy, have ye gone mad?" Or she added, "Have ye seen Isabel Temple's ghost?" "No," said Roger loudly and explosively. "Don't talk any more about that damned ghost. Nobody ever saw it. The whole story is balderdash." He got up and went violently out, leaving Catherine aghast. Was it possible Roger had sworn? What on earth had come over the boy? But come what had, or come what would, he no longer looked fey. There was that much to be thankful for. Even an occasional oath was better than that. Catherine went stiffly about her dishwashing, resolving to have Liza Adams to supper some night. For a week Roger lived in agony, an agony of shame and humiliation and self-contempt. Then, when the edge of his bitter disappointment wore away, he made another dreadful discovery. He still loved her and longed for her just as keenly as before. He wanted madly to see her, her flower-like face, her great asking eyes, the sleek braided flow of her hair. Ghost or woman, spirit or flesh, it mattered not. He could not live without her. At last his hunger for her drew him to the old grey house on the bay shore. He knew he was a fool. She would never look at him. He was only feeding the flame that must consume him. But go he must and did, seeking for his lost paradise. He did not see her when he went in, but Mrs. Barr received him kindly and talked about her in a pleasant, garrulous fashion which jarred on Roger. Yet he listened greedily. Lilith, her aunt told him, had been made deaf by the accidental explosion of a gun when she was 8 years old. She could not hear sound, but she could talk. A little, that is, not much, but enough to get along with. But she don't like talking, somehow. Dunno why. She's shy, and we think maybe she don't like to talk much because she can't hear her own voice. She don't ever speak 'cept just when she has to. But she's been trained to lip reading something wonderful. She can understand anything that's said when she can see the person that's talking. Still, it's a terrible drawback for the poor child. She's never had any real girl life, and she's dreadful sensitive and retiring. We can't get her to go out anywhere, only for lonely walks along shore by herself. We're much obliged for what you did the other night. It ain't safe for her to wander about alone as she does, but it ain't often anybody from the harbour gets up this far. She was dreadful upset about it, hasn't got over her scare yet." When Lilith came in, her ivory white face went scarlet all over at the sight of Roger. She sat down in a shadowy corner. Mrs. Barr got up and went out. Roger was mute. He could find nothing to say. He could have talked glibly enough to Isabel Temple's ghost in some unearthly tryst by her grave, but he could not find a word to say to this slip of flesh and blood. He felt very foolish and absurd and very conscious of his twisted shoulder. What a fool he'd been to come. Then Lilith looked up at him and smiled, a little shy, friendly smile. Roger suddenly saw her not as the tantalizingly unreal mystic thing of the twilight grove, but as a little human creature, exquisitely pretty in her young moon beauty, longing for companionship. He got up, forgetting his ugliness, and went across the room to her. "Will you come for a walk?" he said eagerly. He held out his hand like a child. As a child she stood up and took it. Like two children they went out and down the sunset shore. Roger was again incredibly happy. It was not the same happiness as had been his in that vanished fortnight. It was a homelier happiness, with its feet on the earth. The amazing thing was that he felt she was happy too, happy because she was walking with him, Jarback Temple, whom no girl had even thought about. A certain secret wellspring of fancy that had seemed dry welled up in him sparklingly again. Through the summer weeks the odd courtship went on. Roger talked to her as he had never talked to anyone. He did not find it in the least hard to talk to her, though her necessity of watching his face so closely while he talked bothered him occasionally. He felt that her intent gaze was reading his soul as well as his lips. She never talked much herself. What she did say, she spoke so low that it was hardly above a whisper, but she had a voice as lovely as her face, sweet, cadenced, haunting. Roger was quite mad about her, and he was horribly afraid that he could never get up enough courage to ask her to marry him. And he was afraid that if he did, she would never consent. In spite of her shy, eager welcomes, he could not believe she could care for him. For him? She liked him, she was sorry for him, but it was unthinkable that she, white, exquisite Lilith, could marry him and sit at his table and his hearth. He was a fool to dream of it. To the existence of romance and glamour in which he lived, no gossip of the countryside penetrated. Yet much gossip there was, and at last it came blundering in on Roger to destroy his fairy world a second time. He came downstairs one night in the twilight, ready to go to Lilith. His aunt and an old crony were talking in the kitchen. The crony was old, and Catherine, supposing Roger was out of the house, was talking loudly in that horrible voice of hers, with still more horrible zest and satisfaction. "Yes, I'm guessing it'll be a match, as ye say. Oh, the boy's doing well. He ain't for every market, as I'm bound to admit. If she weren't deaf, she wouldn't look at him, no doubt. But she has scads of money. They won't need to do a tap of work unless they like, and she's a good housekeeper, too, her aunt tells me. She's pretty enough to suit him. He's as particular as never was, and he wasn't crooked and she wasn't deaf when they was born, so it's likely their children will be all right. I'm that proud when I think of the match." Roger fled out of the house, white of face and sick of heart. He went not to the bay shore, but to Isabel Temple's grave. He had never been there since the night when he had rescued Lilith, but now he rushed to it in his new agony. His aunt's horrible practicalities had filled him with disgust. They dragged his love in the dust of sordid things. And Lilith was rich. He had never known that, never suspected it. He could never ask her to marry him now. He must never see her again. For the second time he had lost her, and this second losing could not be borne. He sat down on the big boulder by the grave and dropped his poor grey face in his hands, moaning in anguish. Nothing was left him, not even dreams. He hoped he could soon die. He did not know how long he sat there. He did not know when she came. But when he lifted his miserable eyes, he saw her, sitting just a little way from him on the big stone, and looking at him with something in her face that made his heart beat madly. He forgot Aunt Catherine's sacrilege. He forgot that he was a presumptuous fool. He bent forward and kissed her lips for the first time. The wonder of it loosed his bound tongue. "Lilith," he gasped, "I love you." She put her hand into his and nestled closer to him. "I thought you would have told me that long ago," she said. End of The Tryst of the White Lady. Story number 26 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Uncle Richard's New Year's Dinner. Prissy Baker was in Oscar Miller's store New Year's morning, buying matches, for New Year's was not kept as a business holiday in Quincy, when her Uncle Richard Baker came in. He did not look at Prissy, nor did she wish him a Happy New Year. She would not have dared. Uncle Richard had not been on speaking terms with her or her father, his only brother, for 8 years. He was a big, ruddy, prosperous-looking man, an uncle to be proud of, Prissy thought wistfully, if only he were like other people's uncles, or indeed like what he used to be himself. He was the only uncle Prissy had, and when she had been a little girl they had been great friends. But that was before the quarrel, in which Prissy had had no share, to be sure, although Uncle Richard seemed to include her in his rancour. Richard Baker, so he informed Mr. Miller, was on his way to Navarre with a load of pork. "I didn't intend going over until the afternoon," he said, "but Joe Hemming sent word yesterday he wouldn't be buying pork after 12 today, so I have to tote my hogs over at once. I don't care about doing business New Year's morning." "Should think New Year's would be pretty much the same as any other day to you," said Mr. Miller, for Richard Baker was a bachelor, with only old Mrs. Janeway to keep house for him. "Well, I always like a good dinner on New Year's," said Richard Baker. "It's about the only way I can celebrate. Mrs. Janeway wanted to spend the day with her son's family over at Oriental, so I was laying out to cook my own dinner. I got everything ready in the pantry last night, for I got word about the pork. I won't get back from Navarre before 1 o'clock, so I reckon I'll have to put up with a cold bite." After her Uncle Richard had driven away, Prissy walked thoughtfully home. She had planned to spend a nice, lazy holiday with the new book her father had given her at Christmas and a box of candy. She did not even mean to cook a dinner, for her father had had to go to town that morning to meet a friend and would be gone the whole day. There was nobody else to cook dinner for. Prissy's mother had died when Prissy was a baby. She was her father's housekeeper, and they had jolly times together. But as she walked home, she could not help thinking about Uncle Richard. He would certainly have cold New Year cheer, enough to chill the whole coming year. She felt sorry for him, picturing him returning from Navarre cold and hungry to find a fireless house and an uncooked dinner in the pantry. Suddenly an idea popped into Prissy's head. Dared she? Oh, she never could. But he would never know. There would be plenty of time. She would. Prissy hurried home, put her matches away, took a regretful peep at her unopened book, then locked the door and started up the road to Uncle Richard's house, half a mile away. She meant to go and cook Uncle Richard's dinner for him, get it all beautifully ready, then slip away before he came home. He would never suspect her of it. Prissy would not have him suspect for the world. She thought he would be more likely to throw a dinner of her cooking out of doors than to eat it. 8 years before this, when Prissy had been 9 years old, Richard and Irving Baker had quarrelled over the division of a piece of property. The fault had been mainly on Richard's side, and that very fact made him all the more unrelenting and stubborn. He had never spoken to his brother since, and he declared he never would. Prissy and her father felt very badly over it, but Uncle Richard did not seem to feel badly at all. To all appearance, he had completely forgotten that there were such people in the world as his brother Irving and his niece Prissy. Prissy had no trouble in breaking into Uncle Richard's house, for the woodshed door was unfastened. She tripped into the hostile kitchen with rosy cheeks and mischief sparkling in her eyes. This was an adventure. This was fun. She would tell her father all about it when he came home at night, and what a laugh they would have. There was still a good fire in the stove, and in the pantry Prissy found the dinner in its raw state. A fine roast of fresh pork, potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and the ingredients of a raisin pudding, for Uncle Richard was fond of raisin puddings and could make them as well as Mrs. Janeway could, if that was anything to boast of. In a short time the kitchen was full of bubbling and hissing and appetizing odors. Prissy enjoyed herself hugely, and the raisin pudding, which she rather doubtfully mixed up, behaved itself beautifully. Uncle Richard said he'd be home by 1, said Prissy to herself as the clock struck 12, so I'll set the table now, dish up the dinner, and leave it where it will keep warm until he gets here. Then I'll slip away home. I'd like to see his face when he steps in. I suppose he'll think one of the Jenner girls across the street has cooked this dinner. Prissy soon had the table set, and she was just peppering the turnips when a gruff voice behind her said, "Well, well, what does this mean?" Prissy whirled around as if she had been shot, and there stood Uncle Richard in the woodshed door. Poor Prissy! She could not have looked or felt more guilty if Uncle Richard had caught her robbing his desk. She did not drop the turnips for a wonder, but she was too confused to set them down, so she stood there holding them, her face crimson, her heart thumping, and a horrible choking in her throat. I came up to cook your dinner for you, Uncle Richard," she stammered. "I heard you say in the store that Mrs. Janeway had gone home and that you had nobody to cook your New Year's dinner for you, so I thought I'd come and do it, but I meant to slip away before you came home." Poor Prissy felt that she would never get to the end of her explanation. Would Uncle Richard be angry? Would he order her from the house? "It was very kind of you," said Uncle Richard dryly. "It's a wonder your father let you come." "Father was not home, but I am sure he would not have prevented me if he had been. Father has no hard feelings against you, Uncle Richard." "Humph!" said Uncle Richard. "Well, since you've cooked the dinner, you must stop and help me eat it. It smells good, I must say. Mrs. Janeway always burns the pork when she roasts it. Sit down, Prissy. I'm hungry." They sat down. Prissy felt quite giddy and breathless, and could hardly eat for excitement. But Uncle Richard had evidently brought home a good appetite from Navarre, and he did full justice to his New Year's dinner. He talked to Prissy, too, quite kindly and politely, and when the meal was over he said slowly, "I'm much obliged to you, Prissy, and I don't mind owning to you that I'm sorry for my share in the quarrel, and have wanted for a long time to be friends with your father again. but I was too ashamed and proud to make the first advance. You can tell him so for me, if you like, and if he's willing to let bygones be bygones, tell him I'd like him to come up here with you tonight when he gets home and spend the evening with me." "Oh, he will come, I know," cried Prissy joyfully. "He has felt so badly about not being friendly with you, Uncle Richard. I'm as glad as can be." Prissy ran impulsively around the table and kissed Uncle Richard. He looked up at his tall, girlish niece with a smile of pleasure. "You're a good girl, Prissy, and a kind-hearted one, too, or you'd never have come up here to cook a dinner for a crabbed old uncle who deserved to eat cold dinners for his stubbornness. It made me cross today when folks wished me a Happy New Year. It seemed like mockery when I hadn't a soul belonging to me to make it happy, but it has brought me happiness already, and I believe it will be a happy year all the way through." "Indeed it will," laughed Prissy. "I'm so happy now I could sing. I believe it was an inspiration, my idea of coming up here to cook your dinner for you. You must promise to come and cook my New Year's dinner for me every New Year we live near enough together," said Uncle Richard. And Prissy promised. End of Uncle Richard's New Year's Dinner. Story 27 of L.M. Montgomery Short Stories from 1909 through 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alisa McCaslin, July 2011. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. White Magic. One September afternoon in the year of grace 1840, Avery and Janet Sparhallow were picking apples in their Uncle Daniel Sparhallow's big orchard. It was an afternoon of mellow sunshine about them. Beyond the orchard were old harvest fields, mellowly bright and serene, and beyond the fields the sapphire curve of the St. Lawrence Gulf was visible through the groves of spruce and birch. There was a soft whisper of wind in the trees, and the pale purple asters that feathered the orchard grass swayed gently towards each other. Janet Sparhallow, who loved the outdoor world and its beauty, was for the time being at least very happy, as her little brown face, with its fine satiny skin, plainly showed. Avery Sparhallow did not seem so happy. She worked rather abstractedly and frowned oftener than she smiled. Avery Sparhallow was conceited to be a beauty and had no rival in Burnley Beach. She was very pretty, with the obvious, indisputable prettiness of rich black hair, vivid, certain colour, and laughing, brilliant eyes. Nobody ever called Janet a beauty or even thought her pretty. She was only 17, 5 years younger than Avery, and was rather lanky and weedy, with a rope of straight dark brown hair, long, narrow, shining brown eyes, and very black lashes, and a crooked, clever little mouth. She had visitations of beauty when excited, because then she flushed deeply, and colour made all the difference in the world to her. But she had never happened to look in the glass when excited, so that she had never seen herself beautiful, and hardly anybody else had ever seen her so, because she was always too shy and awkward and tongue-tied in company to feel excited over anything. Yet very little could bring that transforming flush to her face. A wind off the gulf, a sudden glimpse of blue upland, a flame-red poppy, a baby's laugh, a certain footstep. As for Avery Sparhallow, she never got excited over anything, not even her wedding dress, which had come from Charlottetown that day and was incomparably beyond anything that had ever been seen in Burnley Beach before, for it was made of an apple-green silk, sprayed over with tiny rosebuds, which had been specially sent for to England, where Aunt Matilda Sparhallow had a brother in the silk trade. Avery Sparhallow's wedding dress was making far more of a sensation in Burnley Beach than her wedding itself was making, for Randall Burnley had been dangling after her for 3 years, and everybody knew that there was nobody for a Sparhallow to marry except a Burnley, and nobody for a Burnley to marry except a Sparhallow. Only one silk dress, and I want a dozen, Avery had said scornfully. "What would you do with a dozen silk dresses on a farm?" Janet asked wonderingly. "Oh, what indeed!" agreed Avery with an impatient laugh. "Randall will think just as much of you in drugget as in silk," said Janet, meaning to comfort. Again Avery laughed. "That is true. Randall never notices what a woman has on. I like a man who does notice and tells me about it. I like a man who likes me better in silk than in drugget. I will wear this rosebud silk when I'm married, and it will be supposed to last me the rest of my life and be worn on all state occasions, and in time become an heirloom like Aunt Matilda's hideous blue satin. I want a new silk dress every month." Janet paid little attention to this kind of raving. Avery had always been more or less discontented. She would be discontented enough after she was married. Nobody could be discontented who was Randall Burnley's wife. Janet was sure of that. Janet liked picking apples. Avery did not like it, but Aunt Matilda had decreed that the red apples should be picked that afternoon. And Aunt Matilda's word was law at the Sparhallow ranch, even for willful Avery. So they worked and talked as they worked of Avery's wedding, which was to be as soon as Bruce Gordon should arrive from Scotland. "I wonder what Bruce will be like," said Avery. "It is 8 years since he went home to Scotland. He was 16 then. He will be 24 now. He went away a boy. He will come back a man." "I don't remember much about him," said Janet. "I was only 9 when he went away. He used to tease me. I do remember that." There was a little resentment in her voice. Janet had never liked being teased. Avery laughed. "You were so touchy, Janet. Touchy people always get teased. Bruce was very handsome and as nice as he was handsome. Those 2 years he was here were the nicest, gayest time I ever had. I wish he had stayed in Canada, but of course he wouldn't do that. His father was a rich man and Bruce was ambitious. Oh, Janet, I wish I could live in the old land. That would be life." Janet had heard all this before and could not understand it. She had no hankering for either Scotland or England. She loved the new land and its wild virgin beauty. She yearned to the future, never to the past. "I'm tired of Burnley Beach," Avery went on passionately, shaking apples wildly off a laden bough by way of emphasis. "I know all the people, what they are, what they can be. It's like reading a book for the 20th time. I know where I was born and who I'll marry and where I'll be buried. That's knowing too much. All my days will be alike when I marry Randall. There will never be anything unexpected or surprising about them. I tell you, Janet," Avery seized another bough and shook it with a vengeance, "I hate the very thought of it." "The thought of what?" said Janet in bewilderment. "Of marrying Randall Burnley, or marrying anybody down here and settling down on a farm for life." Then Avery sat down on the rung of her ladder and laughed at Janet's face. "You look stunned, Janet. Did you really think I wanted to marry Randall?" Janet was stunned, and she did think that. How could any girl not want to marry Randall Burnley if she had the chance? "Don't you love him?" she asked stupidly. Avery bit into a nut-sweet apple. "No," she said frankly. "Oh, I don't hate him, of course. I like him well enough. I like him very well, but we'll quarrel all our lives." "Then what are you marrying him for?" asked Janet. "Why, I'm getting on, 22. All the girls of my age are married already. I won't be an old maid, and there's nobody but Aunt Randall. Nobody good enough for a Sparhallow, that is. You wouldn't want me to marry Ned Adams or John Buchanan, would you?" "No," said Janet, who had her full share of the Sparhallow pride. "Well, then, of course I must marry Randall. That's settled, and there's no use making faces over the notion. I'm not making faces, but I'm tired of hearing you talk as if you thought I adored him and must be in the seventh heaven because I was going to marry him. You romantic child." "Does Randall know you feel like this?" asked Janet in a low tone. "No. Randall is like all men, vain and self-satisfied, and believes I'm crazy about him. It's just as well to let him think so until we're safely married, anyhow. Randall has some romantic notions, too, and I'm not sure that he'd marry me if he knew, in spite of his 3 years' devotion. And I have no intention of being jilted 3 weeks before my wedding day." Avery laughed again and tossed away the core of her apple. Janet, who had been very pale, went crimson and lovely. She could not endure hearing Randall criticized. Vain and self-satisfied, when there was never a man less so. She was horrified to feel that she almost hated Avery, Avery who did not love Randall. "What a pity Randall didn't take a fancy to you instead of me, Janet," said Avery teasingly. "Wouldn't you like to marry him, Janet? Wouldn't you now?" "No," cried Janet angrily. "I just like Randall. I've liked him ever since that day when I was a little thing and he came here and saved me from being shut up all day in that dreadful dark closet because I broke Aunt Matilda's blue cup, when I hadn't meant to break it. He wouldn't let her shut me up. He is like that. He understands. I want you to marry him because he wants you, and it isn't fair that you nothing is fair in this world, child. Is it fair that I, who am so pretty you know I'm pretty, Janet, and who love life and excitement, should have to be buried on a P.E. Island farm all my days, or else be an old maid because a Sparhallow mustn't marry beneath her? Come, Janet, don't look so woebegone. I wouldn't have told you if I'd thought you'd take it so much to heart. I'll be a good wife to Randall, never fear, and I'll keep him up to the notch of prosperity much better than if I thought him a little lower than the angels. It doesn't do to think a man perfection, Janet, because he thinks so too, and when he finds someone who agrees with him, he is inclined to rest on his oars. At any rate, you don't care for anyone else, said Janet hopefully. Not I. I like Randall as well as I like anybody. Randall won't be satisfied with that, muttered Janet. But Avery did not hear her, having picked up her basket of apples and gone. Janet sat down on the lower rung of the ladder and gave herself up to an unpleasant reverie. Oh, how the world had changed in half an hour! She had never been so worried in her life. She was so fond of Randall. She had always been fond of him. Why, he was just like a brother to her. She couldn't possibly love a brother more, and Avery was going to hurt him. It would hurt him horribly when he found out she did not love him. Janet could not bear the thought of Randall being hurt. It made her fairly savage. He must not be hurt. Avery must love him. Janet could not understand why she did not. Surely everyone must love Randall. It had never occurred to Janet to ask herself, as Avery had asked her, if she would like to marry Randall. Randall could never fancy her a little plain brown thing, only half grown. Nobody could think of her beside beautiful rose-faced Avery. Janet accepted this fact unquestioningly. She had never been jealous. She only felt that she wanted Randall to have everything he wanted, to be perfectly happy. Why, it would be dreadful if he did not marry Avery, if he went and married some other girl. She would never see him then, never have any more delightful talks with him about all the things they both loved so much, winds and delicate dawns, mysterious woods and moonlight and starry midnights, silver white sails going out of the harbour in the magic of morning, and the grey of gulf storms. There would be nothing in life. It would just be one great unbearable emptiness, for she herself would never marry. There was nobody for her to marry, and she didn't care. If she could have Randall for a real brother, she would not mind a bit being an old maid. And there was that beautiful new frame house Randall had built for his bride, which she, Janet, had helped him build, because Avery would not condescend to details of pantry and linen closets and cupboards. Janet and Randall had had such fun over the cupboards. No stranger must ever come to be mistress of that house. Randall must marry Avery. She must love him. Could anything be done to make her love him? I believe I'll go and see Granny Thomas, said Janet desperately. She thought this was a silly idea, but it still haunted her and would not be shaken off. Granny Thomas was a very old woman who lived in Burnley Cove and was reputed to be something of a witch. That is, people who were not Sparhallows or Burnleys gave her that name. Sparhallows or Burnleys, of course, were above believing in such nonsense. Janet was above believing it. But still the sailors along shore were careful to keep on the good side of Granny Thomas, lest she brew an unfavourable wind for them. And there was much talk of love potions. Janet knew that people said Peggy Buchanan would never have got Jack McLeod if Granny had not given her a love potion. Jack had never looked at Peggy, though she was after him for years, and then all at once he was quite mad about her, and married her, and wore her life out with jealousy. And Peggy, the homeliest of all the Buchanan girls. There must be something in it. Janet made a sudden, desperate resolve. She would go to Granny and ask her for a love potion to make Avery love Randall. If Granny couldn't do any good, she couldn't do any harm. Janet was a little afraid of her and had never been near her house. But what wouldn't she do for Randall? Janet never lost much time in carrying out any resolution she made. The next afternoon she slipped away to visit Granny Thomas. She put on her longest dress and did her hair up for the first time. Granny must not think her a child. She rowed herself down the long pond to the row of golden brown sand dunes that parted it from the gulf. It was a wonderful autumn day. There were wild growths and colours and scents in sweet procession all around the pond. Every curve in it revealed some little whim of loveliness. On the left bank, in a grove of birch, was Randall's new house, waiting to be sanctified by love and joy and birth. Janet loved to be alone thus with a delightful day. She was sorry when she had walked over the stretch of windy, weedy sea fields and reached Granny's little tumble-down house at the cove. Sorry and a little frightened as well, but only a little. There was good stuff in Janet. She lifted the latch boldly and walked in when Granny bade. Granny was curled up on a stool by her fireplace, and if ever anybody did look like a witch, she did. She waved her pipe at another stool, and Janet sat down, gazing a little curiously at Granny, whom she had never seen at such close quarters before. "Will I look like that when I am very old?" she thought, beholding Granny's wizened, marvellously wrinkled face. "I wonder if anybody will be sorry when you die." "Staring wasn't thought good manners in my time," said Granny. Then, as Janet blushed crimson under the rebuke, she added, "Keep red like that instead o' white, and you won't need no love ointment." Janet felt a little cold thrill. How did Granny know what she had come for? Was she a real witch, after all? For a moment she wished she hadn't come. Perhaps it was not right to tamper with the powers of darkness. Peggy Buchanan was notoriously unhappy. If Janet had known how to get herself away, she would have gone without asking for anything. Then a sound came from the lean-to behind the house. "Shh! I hear the devil grunting like a pig," muttered Granny, looking very impish. But Janet smiled a little contemptuously. She knew it was a pig and no devil. Granny Thomas was only an old fraud. Her awe passed away and left her cool Sparhallow. "Can you," she said with her own directness, "make a person care for another person? Care very much?" Granny removed her pipe and chuckled. "What you want is toad ointment," she said. Toad ointment? Janet shuddered. That did not sound very nice. Granny noticed the shudder. "Nothing like it," she said, nodding her crone-like old grey head. "There's other things, but no one's so sure. Put a little bit, oh, such a little bit, on his eyelids, and he's yourn for life. You need something powerful. You're no one so pretty, only when you're blushing." Janet was blushing again, so Granny thought she wanted the charm for herself. Well, what did it matter? Randall was the only one to be considered. "Is it very expensive?" she faltered. She had not much money. Money was no plentiful thing on a P.E.I. farm in 1840. "Oh, Noah, oh, Noah," Granny leered. "I don't sell it. I gives it. I like to see young folks happy. You don't need much, as I've said. Just a li'l smooch, and you'll have your man. And send old Granny a bit o' the wedding cake, and fig o' Basie for luck, and a bid to the first christening. Don't forget that, dearie." Janet was cold again with anger. She hated old Granny Thomas. She would never come near her again. "I'd rather pay you its worth," she said coldly. "You couldn't, dearie. What money could be enough for such a treasure? But that's the Sparhallow pride. Well, go. See if the Sparhallow pride and the Sparhallow money will buy you your lad's love." Granny looked so angry that Janet hastened to appease her. "Oh, please forgive me. I meant no offense. Only it must have cost you much trouble to make it." Granny chuckled again. She was vastly pleased to see a Sparhallow suing to her. A Sparhallow! "Toads am cheap," she said. "It's all in knowing how and the time of the moon. Here, take this little pill box. There's enough in it, and put a little bit on his eyelids when you've gotten the chance. And when he looks at you, he'll love you. Mind you, though, that he looks at no other first. It's the first one he sees that he'll love. That's the way it works." "Thank you." Janet took the little box. She wished she dared to go at once, but perhaps this would anger Granny. Granny looked at her with a twinkle in her little, incredibly old eyes. "Be off," she said. "You're in a hurry to go. You're as proud as any of the proud Sparhallows. But I bear you no grudge. I likes proud people when they have to come to me to get help." Janet found herself outside with a relieved heart in her bosom and her little box in her hand. For a moment she was tempted to throw it away. But no, Randall would be so unhappy if he found out Avery didn't love him. She would try the ointment at least. She would try to forget about the toads and not let herself think how it was made. Something might come of it. Janet hurried home along the shore, where a silvery wave broke in a little lovely silvery curve on the sand. She was so happy that her cheeks burned, and Randall Burnley, who was sitting on the edge of her flat when she reached the pond, looked at her with admiration. Janet dropped her box into her pocket stealthily when she saw him. What with her guilty secret, she hardly knew whether she was glad or not when he said he was going to row her up the pond. "I saw you go down an hour ago, and I've been waiting ever since," he said. "Where have you been?" "Oh, I just wanted a walk this lovely day," said Janet miserably. She felt that she was telling an untruth, and this hurt her horribly, especially when it was to Randall. This was what came of truck with witches. You were led into falsehood and deception straight away. Again Janet was tempted to drop Granny's pillbox into the depths of Burnley Pond, and again she decided not to because she saw Randall Burnley's deep-set blue-gray eyes that could look tender or sorrowful or passionate or whimsical as he willed, and thought how they would look when he found Avery did not love him. So Janet drowned the voice of conscience and was brazenly happy. Happy because Randall Burnley rowed her up the pond. Happy because he walked halfway home with her over the autumnal fields. Happy because he talked of the day and the sea and the golden weather, as only Randall could talk. But she thought she was happy because she had in her pocket what might make Avery love him. Randall went as far as the stile in the birch wood between the Burnley and the Sparhallow land, and he kept her there talking for another half hour. And though he talked only of a book he had read and a new puppy he was training, Janet listened with her soul in her ears. She talked, too, quite freely. She was never in the least shy or tongue-tied or awkward in Randall's company. There she was always at her best, with a delightful feeling of being understood. She wondered if he noticed she had her hair done up. Her eyes shone and her brown face was full of rosy, kissable hues. When he finally turned away homeward, life went flat. Janet decided she was very tired after her long walk and her trying interview, but it did not matter, since she had her love potion. That was so much nicer a name than toad ointment. That night Janet rubbed mutton tallow on her hands. She had never done that before. She had thought it vain and foolish, though Avery did it every night. But that afternoon on the pond Randall had said something about the beautiful shape of her pretty slender hands. He had never paid her a compliment before. Her hands were brown and a little hard, not soft and white like Avery's. So Janet resorted to the mutton tallow. If one had a scrap of beauty, if only in one's hands, one might as well take care of it. Having got her ointment, the next thing was to make use of it. This was not so easy, because, in the first place, it must not be done when there was any danger of Avery seeing some other than Randall first, and it must be done without Avery knowing it. The two problems combined were almost too much for Janet. She bided her chance like a watchful cat, but it did not come. 2 weeks went by and it had not come. Janet was getting very desperate. The wedding day was only a week away. The bride's cake was made and the turkeys fattened. The invitations were sent out. Janet's own bridesmaid dress was ready, and still the little pillbox in the till of Janet's blue chest was unopened. She had never even opened it, lest virtue escape. Then her chance came at last. Unexpectedly one evening at dusk, when Janet was crossing the little dark upstairs hall, Aunt Matilda called up to her, "Janet, send Avery down. There's a young man wanting to see her." Aunt Matilda was laughing a little, as she always did when Randall came. It was a habit with her, hanging over from the early days of Randall's courtship. Janet went on into their room to tell Avery, and lo, Avery was lying asleep on her bed, tired out from her busy day. Janet, after one glance, flew to her chest. She took out her pillbox and opened it, a little fearfully. The toad ointment was there, dark and unpleasant enough to view. Janet tiptoed breathlessly to the bed and gingerly scraped the tip of her finger in the ointment. She said so little would be enough. "Oh, I hope I'm not doing wrong." Trembling with excitement, she brushed lightly the white lids of Avery's eyes. Avery stirred and opened them. Janet guiltily thrust her pillbox behind her. "Randall's downstairs asking for you, Avery." Avery sat up, looking annoyed. She had not expected Randall that evening and would greatly have preferred a continuance of her nap. She went down crossly enough, but looking very lovely, flushed from sleep. Janet stood in their room, clasping her cold hands nervously over her breast. Would the charm work? Oh, she must know. She must know. She could not wait. After a few moments that seemed like years, she crept down the stairs and out into the dusk of the June warm September night. Like a shadow she slipped up to the open parlour window and looked cautiously in between the white muslin curtains. The next minute she had fallen on her knees in the mint bed. She wished she could die then and there. The young man in the parlour was not Randall Burnley. He was dark and smart and handsome. He was sitting on the sofa by Avery's side, holding her hands in his, smiling into her rosy, delighted, excited face. And he was Bruce Gordon, no doubt of that, Bruce Gordon, the expected cousin from Scotland. "Oh, what have I done? What have I done?" moaned poor Janet, wringing her hands. She had seen Avery's face quite plainly, had seen the look in her eyes. Avery had never looked at Randall Burnley like that. Granny Thomas's abominable ointment had worked all right, and Avery had fallen in love with the wrong man. Janet, cold with horror and remorse, dragged herself up to the window again and listened. She must know. She must be sure. She could hear only a word here and there, but that word was enough. "I thought you promised to wait for me, Avery," Bruce said reproachfully. "You were so long in coming back I thought you'd forgotten me," cried Avery. "I think I did forget a little, Avery. I was such a boy. But now well, thank heaven I haven't come too late." There was a silence, and shameless Janet, peering above the window sill, saw what she saw. It was enough. She crept away upstairs to her room. She was lying there across the bed when Avery swept in, a splendid, transfigured Avery, flushed, triumphant. Janet sat up, pallid, tear-stained, and looked at her. "Janet," said Avery, "I'm going to marry Bruce Gordon next Wednesday night instead of Randall Burnley." Janet sprang forward and caught Avery's hand. "You must not!" she cried wildly. "It's all my fault. Oh, if I could only die! I got the love ointment from Granny Thomas to rub on your eyes to make you love the first man you could see. I meant it to be Randall. I thought it was Randall. Oh, Avery!" Avery had been listening between amazement and anger. Now anger mastered amazement. "Janet Sparhallow," she cried, "are you crazy? Or do you mean that you went to Granny Thomas, you, a Sparhallow, and asked her for a love philtre to make me love Randall Burnley?" "I didn't tell her it was for you," she thought. "I wanted it for myself," moaned Janet. "Oh, we must undo it. I'll go to her again. No doubt she knows of some way to undo the spell." Avery, whose rages never lasted long, threw back her dark head and laughed ringingly. "Janet Sparhallow, you talk as if you lived in the Dark Ages. The idea of supposing that horrid old woman could give you love philtres! Why, girl, I've always loved Bruce, always. But I thought he'd forgotten me, and tonight when he came I found he hadn't. There's the whole thing in a nutshell. I'm going to marry him and go home with him to Scotland." "And what about Randall?" said Janet, corpse white. "Oh, Randall, pooh! Do you suppose I'm worrying about Randall? But you must go to him tomorrow and tell him for me, Janet." "I will not. I will not." "Then I'll tell him myself, and I'll tell him about you going to Granny," said Avery cruelly. "Janet, don't stand there looking like that. I've no patience with you. I shall be perfectly happy with Bruce. I would have been miserable with Randall. I know I shan't sleep a wink tonight, I'm so excited. Why, Janet, I'll be Mrs. Gordon of Gordon Bray, and I'll have everything heart can desire and the man of my heart to boot. What has lanky Randall Burnley with his little six-roomed house to set against that?" If Avery did not sleep, neither did Janet. She lay awake till dawn, suffering such misery as she had never endured in her life before. She knew she must go to Randall Burnley tomorrow and break his heart. If she did not, Avery would tell him what Janet had done, and he must not know that. He must not. Janet could not bear that thought. It was a pallid, dull-eyed Janet who went through the birch wood to the Burnley farm next afternoon, leaving behind her an excited household where the sudden change of bridegrooms, as announced by Avery, had rather upset everybody. Janet found Randall working in the garden of his new house, setting out rose bushes for Avery, Avery who was to jilt him at the very altar, so to speak. He came over to open the gate for Janet, smiling his dear smile. It was a dear smile. Janet caught her breath over the dearness of it, and she was going to blot it off his face. She spoke out with plainness and directness. When you had to deal a mortal blow, why try to lighten it? "Avery sent me to tell you that she's going to marry Bruce Gordon instead of you. He came last night, and she says that she has always liked him best." A very curious change came over Randall's face, but not the change Janet had expected to see. Instead of turning pale, Randall flushed, and instead of a sharp cry of pain and incredulity, Randall said, in no uncertain tones, "Thank God." Janet wondered if she were dreaming. Granny Thomas's love potion seemed to have turned the world upside down. for Randall's arms were about her, and Randall was pressing his lean, bronzed cheek to hers, and Randall was saying, "Now I can tell you, Janet, how much I love you." "Me? Me?" choked Janet. "You! Why, you're in the very core of my heart, girl. Don't tell me you can't love me. You can, you must. Why, Janet," for his eyes had caught and locked with hers for a minute, "you do." There were 5 minutes about which nobody can tell anything, for even Randall and Janet never knew clearly just what happened in those 5 minutes. Then Janet, feeling somehow as if she had died and then come back to life, found her tongue. "3 years ago you came courting Avery," she said reproachfully. "3 years ago you were a child. I did not think about you. I wanted a wife, and Avery was pretty. I thought I was in love with her. Then you grew up all at once, and we were such good friends. I never could talk to Avery. She wasn't interested in anything I said. And you have eyes that catch a man. I've always thought of your eyes. But I was honor bound to Avery. I didn't dream you cared. You must marry me next Wednesday, Janet. We'll have a double wedding. You won't mind being married so soon?" "Oh, no, I won't mind," said Janet dazedly. "Only, oh, Randall, I must tell you. I didn't mean to tell you. I'd have rather died. But now I must tell you about it now, because I can't bear anything hidden between us. I went to old Granny Thomas and got a love ointment from her to make Avery love you, because I knew she didn't, and I wanted you to be happy. Randall, don't. I can't talk when you do that. Do you think Granny's ointment could have made her care for Bruce?" Randall laughed, the little low laugh of the triumphant lover. "If it did, I'm glad of it. But I need no such ointment on my eyes to make me love you. You carry your philtre in that elfin little face of yours, Janet." End of White Magic. End of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1909 through 1922.